SpongeBob SquarePants spent 25 years being called one of the silliest cartoons ever made. Most people watched it and saw exactly what it wanted them to see, but a writer on the show went on record and confirmed something far darker than any fan expected about where Bikini Bottom actually sits. In this video, we break down what everyone missed about Bikini Bottom, the real place under the show. Somewhere in the northern Pacific Ocean, roughly halfway between Hawaii and the coast of Papua New Guinea, there is a ring of coral islands sitting just above the equator. The ring is part of a larger chain called the Marshall Islands, and within that chain, one atoll in particular has carried a heavier history than almost any other piece of land its size anywhere on Earth. The local name for it is Bikini, from the Marshallese words for the surface of the coconut, a name given to the islands by the people who lived there long before any outside power ever arrived to change what the place meant or what would happen to it. The version of that name that most of the world knows is the anglicized one, the colonial spelling that flattened and simplified the original into something that sounded easier to a Western ear. That version is Bikini, and beneath that ring of coral islands, at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, sits the fictional underwater city of Bikini Bottom, home to a talking sponge and his friends, one of the most commercially successful cartoon worlds ever built. Most people who grew up watching SpongeBob SquarePants in the years after it premiered in May of 1999 never gave the name of the town more than a passing thought. It sounded funny. It had the word bikini in it, which added a mild layer of absurdity to the whole thing. And absurdity was what the show ran on. Nobody needed it to mean anything more than that. The show never explained the name, never pointed to a map, never offered a footnote or a sidebar tracing the location back to any real place. The humor was fast and broad and deliberately surface level, the kind that worked best when everything seemed loose and cheerful and slightly unhinged. The world of Bikini Bottom looked like a place someone had invented on a Tuesday afternoon for the purpose of making children laugh. And for the first several years of the show's run, that is essentially all most viewers ever thought it was. What that name actually points to, once someone looks, is a location with one of the most haunting and politically complicated histories of any place tied to 20th century American military power. Bikini Atoll was chosen by the United States government in the years immediately following World War II as one of two primary locations for the testing and development of nuclear weapons technology during the Cold War. The reason it was chosen was practical and brutal in equal measure. The islands were extremely remote, the surrounding ocean was vast enough to absorb the scale of what was planned, and the population was small enough that displacing it seemed, to the people making the decision, manageable. In 1946, the United States government approached the 167 people living on Bikini Atoll and told them they were being asked to leave temporarily so that the tests could take place for the good of mankind. A phrase that has been quoted in accounts of the conversation ever since, not as an endorsement of the promise it carried, but as evidence of how the decision was framed to people who had very little power to refuse it. The Bikinians were relocated to Rongerik Atoll, a smaller and far less fertile set of islands to the east, where the food supply turned out to be so inadequate that the displaced community faced starvation within a relatively short span of time after the move. They were eventually shifted to other locations, including a period spent on a Navy vessel, as the U.S. government continued to carry out the testing program it had promised them would be temporary. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States detonated 23 nuclear weapons in and around Bikini Atoll, a series of tests that included some of the most powerful explosions ever deliberately triggered by human beings up to that point in history. The largest of these tests, a detonation on the 1st of March in 1954, known as Castle Bravo, created an explosion equivalent to roughly 1,000 times the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, destroyed 3 islands in the atoll entirely, and spread radioactive fallout across an enormous stretch of the surrounding Pacific Ocean, contaminating nearby inhabited islands and the crews of fishing boats working in waters that the United States had failed to properly clear of traffic before conducting the test. The fallout from Castle Bravo was far larger than the scientists conducting the test had predicted, a failure of calculation that became one of the defining early examples of how little even the people designing these weapons fully understood about what they were creating. The contamination spread across a wide enough area to affect the populations of several nearby atolls whose residents had not been evacuated. People who had no idea a test was taking place, and no warning that what was drifting down on them was dangerous. The health consequences for those communities and their descendants stretched across generations, and the event is commemorated by the people of the Marshall Islands every year on the 1st of March as a day of nuclear remembrance. The Bikinians, who had been told they could return home once the tests were finished, never fully returned to stay. In the 1970s, the United States government allowed approximately 200 people to move back to the atoll, only to evacuate them again in 1978, after scientists determined that the people who had been living there and eating locally grown food had ingested more radioactive cesium from the environment than any other documented human population. The contamination in the soil and the groundwater was so thorough that the islands remained uninhabitable for sustained occupation for decades after the last bomb was detonated, and the projected timescale for the atoll to be genuinely safe for permanent resettlement continues to stretch further into the future than anyone involved in the original decision appears to have anticipated. The Bikini people exist now as a diaspora, settled across other islands in the Marshall Islands chain, their homeland technically within reach and practically beyond it, a legal status that has generated ongoing disputes about compensation, sovereignty, and accountability that remain unresolved well into the 21st century. All of that history sits directly underneath the bright, cartoonish streets of Bikini Bottom, embedded in the name of the place and in the confirmed geography of where the show is set. The show's own internal materials have always placed Bikini Bottom in the Pacific Ocean beneath Bikini Atoll. A Nickelodeon program summary describing the show's setting made the geographic location explicit. What was long treated by most fans and viewers as simply a funny name for a fictional underwater town turned out, on closer examination, to be a specific, real coordinate with a specific, documented, and deeply troubled history attached to it. The question of whether that history was placed there deliberately and what it was supposed to mean for the show's own mythology stayed genuinely murky for most of the series' run. Steven Hillenburg, who had trained as a marine biologist and who was deeply familiar with the ocean as a place of real scientific and cultural significance, chose the name and the location. Hillenburg had grown up watching the documentaries of Jacques Cousteau and had spent years teaching children about marine ecosystems at an educational institute in California before he ever worked in animation. The idea that he chose the name Bikini Bottom without knowing where bikini was seems hard to support, given what is known about his background and his care for the world he was building. But Hillenburg himself was notoriously private about the deeper intentions behind the show's choices, and for many years, no one from the production made a direct, clear statement about how much the nuclear history of the real atoll was meant to inform the world being constructed beneath it. What the show itself contains, spread quietly across decades of episodes, is a set of details that only begin to make sense once the real geography is in view. The explosions that happen throughout the series, which are frequent and vary enormously in size depending on the episode's needs, follow a specific visual shape in many of their larger versions. A mushroom-like column of water rising from a churning base, a shape that closely echoes the photographs taken of the actual underwater nuclear detonation conducted at Bikini Atoll during Operation Crossroads in 1946. The Baker shot, one of two detonations conducted during that initial testing series, was triggered underwater and produced one of the most photographed explosions in history, a column of vaporized water rising tens of thousands of feet into the air from the surface of the lagoon. The specific visual shape of that explosion, widely reproduced in the years following the tests, appears to have become the template for how explosions look inside the show's visual language. This is not speculation applied from outside the production. It lines up with documented use of actual Baker detonation footage in the episode Dying for Pi, which the reference material in this project's own files already covers, showing that the show was actively aware of and drawing from the real event that happened at that real location. The larger question of whether the show was building toward a coherent explanation for why the creatures of Bikini Bottom can think, speak, build structures, run businesses, and engage with the full range of human social life stayed unanswered in any official context for most of the show's run. A theory that circulated online tracing back to an early Reddit post, laid out the argument that the mutations produced by the nuclear testing on Bikini Atoll were the in-universe explanation for how ordinary sea creatures became the anthropomorphic characters viewers were watching every week. A crab who can do math and manage accounts, a sponge who can feel genuine emotion and cook a burger of legendary reputation, a starfish capable of forming lasting friendships despite very limited cognitive capacity, a squid who can play musical instruments and experience genuine aesthetic ambition. The theory held that all of these were the downstream result of decades of radiation transforming the biology and psychology of the creatures who lived in the water beneath the test site. That theory received its most significant confirmation in late 2024, when a longtime writer and performer on the show, the person who voices Plankton, spoke about it directly in a published interview with Esquire magazine. He confirmed that the nuclear test site reading of Bikini Bottom was, in his framing, part of the fun of the show, a deliberate layer of meaning that the writers were aware of and that informed how they thought about the world they were building. What he added, however, went considerably further than simply confirming the radiation theory. He stated that the original conception of the show included a darker layer still. The human world above Bikini Bottom was supposed to be dead. The world upstairs, in his telling, was gone, leaving Bikini Bottom as a kind of last inhabited place, an isolated pocket of life in an otherwise destroyed planet, the nuclear testing having extended far beyond the atoll to consume the surface world entirely. That detail, if accurate as a description of what was originally planned, or at least seriously discussed during the show's development, reframes virtually everything about Bikini Bottom in a way that most viewers spending 25 years watching the show would never have had reason to suspect. The cheerful suburban streets, the clam-shaped mall, the talking fish going about their daily routines with the same mundane concerns as any small American town. All of it taking place in what was originally conceived as the only surviving society left on a planet that had been ended by its own weapons. The show that launched 1,000 lunchboxes and produced more memes than almost any other piece of children's media in the internet age was, in some foundational sense, a post-apocalyptic survival story filtered through the specific medium of a cartoon sponge's daily commute to a fast food job. The confirmation is complicated by the fact that the show as it actually aired never committed fully to this reading. Human beings appear in several early episodes, including a memorable sequence in the second season episode Frankendoodle, in which an artist in a rowboat above the ocean accidentally drops his pencil into the sea, and later episodes across the series feature humans in various forms, suggesting the surface world is far from empty. Whatever the original intention may have been in the show's earliest conceptual stages, the aired version pulled back from committing to a fully post-apocalyptic framework and left the relationship between the human world above and the cartoon world below in a state of productive ambiguity that the show never resolved, and apparently, based on what its creator said on the subject, never intended to resolve. Hillenburg was generally resistant to the idea of explaining the show's internal logic in ways that might reduce its imaginative freedom, preferring the world of Bikini Bottom to feel like something that had its own internal rules, without ever needing those rules spelled out completely. What remains, stripped of the darker implication, but retaining what has been confirmed, is still a surprisingly rich piece of embedded history. A show designed to be funny and fast and full of physical comedy, placed its setting at the exact coordinates of one of the most significant and damaging episodes of 20th century American military activity, then quietly structured its visual language and its population of mutated anthropomorphic sea creatures in ways that rewarded any viewer who happened to look up where Bikini Atoll actually was and what happened there. The hollowness of the original promise made to the Bikinian people, the gap between what was described as temporary and what turned out to be permanent, the disparity between the enormous resources put into the testing program and the resources put into addressing its consequences for the people most directly harmed. None of that is in the show in any explicit sense, but the name is there, the location is there, the visual echo of the mushroom cloud is there, and the confirmed awareness on the part of the people who made it that they were building a world inside the crater of something real is there too. For viewers who who watched the show for years without any of this in mind, the knowledge changes almost nothing about the experience of watching a sponge try to get his driving license, or a starfish explain why mayonnaise is not in fact an instrument. The jokes still land. The characters are still the same. What shifts is the faint, quiet awareness that the cheerful underwater town at the center of 25 years of popular culture was built on a foundation that the real world put there first, long before any cartoon arrived to build over it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The town's name was chosen by a man who knew exactly what it pointed to, and the darkest layer of what it was supposed to mean has only recently been confirmed. Next comes the building most viewers visited in every episode without ever realizing what it was actually shaped like or why. Section 2. The building that was always a trap. There is a joke hiding in plain sight in almost every episode of this show, one that requires no deep knowledge of animation history or production trivia to access, only the willingness to look at a familiar building from the right angle. The Krusty Krab sits at the center of the series, the way a courthouse or a diner sits at the center of a small town, the place everything passes through eventually, the location the camera returns to again and again across decades of episodes, because the writers understood early that the best comedy often grows out of a confined, familiar space where the same characters have to keep dealing with each other. Most viewers accepted the building as simply the shape it happened to be, a wooden structure with glass panels and a clam-shaped sign out front, distinctive enough to be instantly recognizable and generic enough to feel like a plausible fast food restaurant in a cartoon town. Almost nobody looked at it and thought about what it was actually modeled after. The answer is sitting right there in the silhouette, once someone points it out. The Krusty Krab is shaped like a lobster trap. The specific design is not a coincidence or a vague visual rhyme with something that happens to exist in the real ocean. Steven Hillenburg, who built every corner of this world with far more intention than the show's reputation as a cheerful children's cartoon might suggest, confirmed directly in interviews that he based the building's design on a New England lobster trap, the kind used commercially along the American Northeast coast. The long wooden chassis, the glass panels that function like windows, the way the whole structure sits low and wide against the ocean floor, all of it maps precisely onto the shape of a trap designed to lure sea creatures inside and prevent them from leaving. The Krusty Krab does not just look like a lobster trap, it is a lobster trap, redrawn and scaled up and planted in a fictional underwater town as the most popular restaurant in Bikini Bottom. Once that is in place, everything that happens inside the building takes on a slightly different quality. Customers arrive, drawn by the smell of the food and the reputation of the Krabby Patty, and they pay whatever Mr. Krabs chooses to charge them that particular day. The prices in the show are famously inconsistent across episodes, shifting between $1 and 25 cents for a standard patty in some episodes, and considerably more in others, depending on what the joke requires. But the principle underneath the inconsistency is always the same. Mr. Krabs sets the price and the customers pay it, because the Krusty Krab has no real competition, because the Chum Bucket across the street has never once succeeded in drawing customers away with anything resembling a reliable product, and because the Krabby Patty's hold on the population of Bikini Bottom is described at various points in the series as something closer to a biological need than a simple food preference. The second SpongeBob movie contains a line from Mr. Krabs himself, delivered with complete sincerity during a moment of genuine civic crisis, stating that the Krabby Patty is what holds the entire social order together. That line was meant as a joke. It also accurately describes the structural role the restaurant and its product play in the show's fictional economy. The lobster trap draws them in, and once they have tasted what it offers, leaving is no longer a genuine option. The person who owned the trap, in the original conception of the building's meaning, was Hillenburg himself, or rather, the version of him filtered through memory and exaggeration into the character of Eugene Krabs. Hillenburg worked as a fry cook and a lobster boiler at a fast food seafood restaurant in Maine during the summers following high school, a job he has described in interviews as formative in ways he did not fully recognize until years later. The restaurant where he worked reportedly had staff who dressed as pirates and sang to entertain entertain young customers, a detail that planted itself in his memory and eventually resurfaced as the nautical theme running through every corner of the Krusty Krab's design, from the steering wheel tables to the ship's bow-shaped order window to the cluster of maritime signal flags mounted above the front door. The manager at that restaurant is the person Hillenburg drew on when constructing Mr. Krabs, a boss he described as having a strong Maine accent and a manner that reminded him of a pirate in the way he ran his business. The actual manager was not, by Hillenburg's own account, a greedy person in any notable sense, and that quality was something Hillenburg added to the character deliberately, because a restaurant owner who loved money above all other things was funnier and generated better conflict than one who was simply competent and decent. The name went through a revision before the show ever reached Nickelodeon. In Hillenburg's earliest versions of the concept, the restaurant was called the Krusty Krab, spelled with a C in both words, a name that described the building's general aesthetic in straightforward terms. Hillenburg changed the spelling to Krusty Krab shortly before production began on the show's pilot episode, deciding that the letter K was funnier in this context than a C, that the mismatch between the sound and the expected spelling added a layer of absurdity that fit the show's overall sensibility better. He also changed the name of the owner from Krabs to Crabs for the same reason, keeping the word clearly identifiable as the crustacean while pushing it just slightly off-center through the misspelling. A small but deliberate choice that says something about how carefully Hillenburg thought about the texture of the world he was building, down to the spelling of a character's surname. The history of the building inside the show's own internal continuity adds another layer that most casual viewers never encounter, because it exists only in a single episode that plays as much as a lore delivery mechanism as it does as a joke. The episode Krusty Krab Training Video from the show's third season presents itself as an instructional film for new employees, narrated in the style of the kind of corporate onboarding video that defined the aesthetics of workplace training materials in the 1980s and early 1990s. Within that episode's framing, viewers receive a brief history of the building itself that most episodes never touch on. Before Eugene Krabs converted it into a restaurant, the Krusty Krab was a retirement home. It was called the Rusty Krab at that stage, and it functioned as a facility for elderly Bikini Bottom residents. Mr. Krabs purchased the building and converted it into its current use, keeping the essential shape and adding whatever was necessary to transform a retirement home into a fast food operation. The Lobster Trap, in other words, was first a place where the old went to live out the final stage of their lives, before it became the place where the entire population went to consume the thing they apparently could not live without. That detail exists in exactly one episode and is never revisited or confirmed in any other canonical context. The show's relationship with its own internal continuity is famously loose, built around the principle that any given episode's version of events takes priority over consistency with what came before, and the Krusty Krab training video's backstory for the building is just one example among many of the show establishing something as real inside its own world and then never returning to it. Whether the retirement home origin is meant to be taken as genuinely true within the show's mythology, or simply as a joke built for one specific episode, is something the show itself has never resolved, leaving fans who care about these things to make their own determination based on how much weight they want to give to a single piece of throwaway lore delivered inside a corporate parody. What the building definitely is, across all versions of the show and all interpretations of its internal history, is a place owned entirely by someone whose relationship with money supersedes every other consideration. Mr. Krabs has paid SpongeBob across different episodes with a nickel a day, with a fake currency called Wacky Bucks, and with a different made-up denomination called Krusty Cash. This last one specifically described as a currency that cannot actually be spent at the Krusty Krab itself, meaning the employee being paid in it cannot even use his wages at his own workplace. Other episodes show SpongeBob paying Mr. Krabs for the privilege of working there, rather than the other way around, and still others show the salary as a number so small it functions as a recurring joke about how comprehensively the restaurant owner has removed any practical benefit from the labor agreement beyond the act of working itself. One episode made this explicit enough that an arbitration proceeding followed, with Squidward filing formal complaints about wages and conditions, and ultimately being forced by Mr. Krabs to pay for the very act of striking, a resolution that collapsed any distinction between employment and what it was imitating. None of that would read quite the same if the building housing all of it were not designed as a lobster trap. The design is the joke, carried silently through every single episode that features the Krusty Krab exterior, available to anyone who knows what they are looking at, and invisible to everyone who does not. The people making the show never drew direct attention to it in the episodes themselves, never had a character comment on the irony of a crab running a building shaped like the device used to catch and trap crustaceans, never made the connection explicit in any dialogue or visual gag that would have forced the audience to notice it. It simply sat there, across hundreds of episodes and more than 2 decades of television, shaped like what it was, doing what it was built to do. The irony of the design is worth sitting with for a moment because it operates on several levels at once, depending on how deeply someone wants to read it. At the most surface level, a crab who owns a building shaped like a lobster trap is simply a visual joke, the kind of background absurdity that Hillenburg and his early writing team planted everywhere in the show's design, on the understanding that attentive viewers would find it eventually. A step further in, the building's function as a trap maps so precisely onto Mr. Krabs' entire economic philosophy that it starts to feel less like a coincidence and more like a design choice that was planned from the beginning to mean exactly what it appears to mean. A step further still, the fact that the trap draws in sea creatures of all kinds, including crabs, including the owner's own daughter Pearl, who is seen paying for food at the Krusty Krab in multiple episodes, and including Mr. Krabs himself, who has been shown consuming Krabby Patties on various occasions, suggests the trap works on everyone without distinction, a closed loop in which the person who set the trap is also inevitably caught inside it. The Krabby Patty's secret formula adds a final layer to the building's design that the show never explicitly connects to the lobster trap reading, but that sits alongside it in an interesting way. The formula is the reason customers come back. It is the engine of the Krusty Krab's success, more powerful as a piece of the show's mythology than the building itself or the character of Mr. Krabs, something that functions across the series less like a recipe and more like an addiction built into the population of Bikini Bottom at a level no character ever successfully resists. The formula has never been revealed, a choice Hillenburg was passionate about maintaining and which he apparently kept even from most of his own writing staff. According to accounts from the show's production, Hillenburg was the only person who ever saw the complete formula, and he took the position that revealing it would destroy its value as a narrative engine. An animator who worked on the show stated in 2019 that Hillenburg felt he was the only one who knew what it was, and that since Hillenburg passed away in 2018, the complete formula may exist now only in whatever notes or documents he left behind. What that means for the building's design is a quiet kind of completeness. The trap works because of what it contains. The formula is what keeps the trap operational, and the trap is operated by a crab who is, in the terms the show itself has established, the single most financially motivated character in Bikini Bottom. Someone who will charge his own employees to work for him and pay them in currency that cannot be spent on his own premises, all while sitting inside a building whose silhouette communicates the entire relationship between owner and customer better than any dialogue ever could, for anyone willing to look at it from the right angle and recognize what shape they are actually looking at. The show never asks viewers to do that work. It just builds the trap and opens the door. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The building at the center of the show was always shaped like a trap, and the man who designed it spent his summers before animation school working in the real version of the job it contains. Next comes the character standing behind the cash register inside that building, the one whose name has been wrong since the first episode, and whose design conceals a deliberate choice about what intelligence looks like from the outside. Section 3. The name that was always wrong. Standing behind the cash register at the Krusty Krab, in every episode across every season, is a character the show has always called Squidward. The name is right there in the opening credits, printed clearly, repeated across decades of merchandise, embedded in the memories of everyone who grew up with the show. It is one of the most recognizable character names in the history of children's animation, a name that sounds exactly like what it is describing, a creature related to the squid, operating on the same general body plan, living in the same underwater world where squid would naturally be found. There is no ambiguity in the name. There is no trick in it that announces itself. It is simply, on the surface, the name of a squid character in a show about sea creatures. Squidward is not a squid. He is an octopus. This has been confirmed repeatedly by the show's own creator and by the production team across multiple interviews and official materials, and it has been visually legible in his design since the first episode. If someone happens to know what physical features distinguish one cephalopod from the other. The bulbous, rounded head sitting on top of his body, large and domed, and slightly ridiculous looking in proportion to everything below it, is the specific visual marker of an octopus rather than a squid. Squids have a more elongated, conical shape to their body, with fins running along each side and a distinctly different overall silhouette. Octopuses have the swelling, rounded mantle that Squidward's head has looked like since 1999. Hillenburg designed him as an octopus from the beginning, chose an octopus because he wanted a specific kind of head shape, and then gave the character a name built around the word squid, and the show ran for a quarter of a century without ever once correcting the record inside an episode. The reason Hillenburg chose the octopus body plan for this character specifically comes from something he said in interviews about what the design needed to communicate before any dialogue was ever written. He wanted SpongeBob's immediate neighbor to read as an intellectual, someone who believed in his own superiority and carried that belief visibly in his physical presence. The octopus's large, rounded head was the visual shorthand for that quality. A big head, in the tradition of cartoon character design, suggests a big brain, and a character who thinks of himself as vastly smarter and more refined than the cheerful, mildly chaotic sponge living next door needed a head that announced that self-assessment immediately, even before the character opened his mouth. The squid's body shape, more streamlined and less visually dominant in that particular way, did not serve the joke as effectively. Hillenburg went with the octopus because the octopus looked more like someone who would spend his evenings practicing the clarinet alone in a house shaped like a monument to ancient culture, convinced that the rest of Bikini Bottom simply did not have the capacity to appreciate him. The name followed a different logic entirely, one that had less to do with visual design and more to do with how words sound when they are said out loud. The character's full name is Squidward Quincy Tentacles, a construction that has a specific rhythm to it, each part adding weight to the whole. Squidward, as a name, flows. It sounds like something that could plausibly belong to a self-important, artistically inclined sea creature with strong opinions about everything. The alternative, matching the name to the actual species, would have required something built around the word octopus, and every version of that produces a result that the show's own creators and cast members confirmed simply did not work. Roger Bumpus, the actor who has voiced Squidward since the beginning, addressed the question directly at various points, and his summary of the situation was simple and unambiguous. Octoword, he said, just did not work. The sound of it was wrong. The rhythm was wrong. The whole thing collapsed when spoken aloud, whereas Squidward landed cleanly and immediately, memorable on first hearing, in a way that Octoword would never have been, regardless of its scientific accuracy. Hillenburg himself made a similar point, describing the choice as a matter of what the character's world required over what biology would strictly dictate. The show was built by someone who understood marine biology well enough to teach it to children for years, and who cared deeply about representing the ocean accurately, wherever accuracy and comedy could coexist. But he also understood that a children's cartoon is not a field guide, and that the needs of the story and the character take precedence over taxonomic correctness when the two are in conflict. Squidward needed to be an octopus because of his head. Squidward needed to be called Squidward because of how names sound. Those two truths simply did not align, and the show chose both of them and let the gap between them sit there indefinitely, unacknowledged, inside the episodes themselves. The number of limbs Squidward is drawn with adds another layer to this. Octopuses have 8 arms. Squidward, across the vast majority of his appearances in the show, is drawn with 6. Hillenburg explained this choice as a practical animation decision, stating that drawing the character consistently with 8 limbs made him look overburdened, as though though the weight of all those appendages was dragging the design down and making it harder to read at the speed of animation. 6 was simpler, cleaner, and more legible in motion. The show committed to 6 limbs as Squidward's standard and maintained it across seasons, with only 2 exceptions that fans have documented and discussed at length. In the episode Pressure from the 2nd season, a live-action sequence showing real octopuses in actual ocean footage briefly makes Squidward's 8-limbed reality visible. And in Sold from the 9th season, a brief moment catches him with a full 8. Outside those 2 instances, 6 is the consistent count. Another compromise between what the character biologically is and what the character needed to be for the show to work. There is something specifically right about Squidward being an octopus in disguise, even if the disguise was never intended as a narrative element. The character's entire personality is built around presenting one version of himself to the world, while being, underneath that presentation, something quite different. The Squidward the show introduces in every episode is a failed artist, a bitter cashier, a sour and territorial neighbor who treats his proximity to SpongeBob and Patrick as an ongoing personal injustice. He considers himself above his circumstances and makes no real effort to hide that assessment, wearing his contempt for his job, his co-workers, and most of Bikini Bottom's population as something closer to a badge of distinction than a source of shame. He aspires to recognition as a musician and painter in a world that has consistently declined to provide it, and he responds to that gap between his self-image and his actual reception with an irritability that the show plays primarily as comedy, but that occasionally tips into something genuinely melancholy. What the show also reveals across its run, in episodes that gave Squidward more room to exist as a character than a simple straight man to SpongeBob's chaos, is that the presentation and the reality are separated by a significant distance. When Squidward's clarinet playing is allowed to succeed, when the conditions align in a way that lets him perform well and be heard, the music is sometimes genuinely moving, a detail the show treats with unexpected sincerity in episodes like Band Geeks, which is consistently ranked by fans and critics as among the finest the series ever produced. When Squidward is put in a situation that requires actual connection with another character, rather than managing distance from everyone around him, those connections form more readily than his permanent air of superiority would suggest he was capable of. The octopus underneath the squid name is not simply a biological inaccuracy. It is a character whose fundamental nature was always slightly different from what the surface presentation announced. The house he lives in reinforces this. Squidward's home on Conch Street is a giant stone head. Its design based directly on the Moai statues of Easter Island, the enormous carved figures that stand along the coast of Rapa Nui and have been one of the most widely recognized images associated with Polynesian culture since they became broadly known to the outside world. Hillenburg's inspiration for the visual design of Bikini Bottom drew heavily on Polynesian aesthetics, something he has discussed in relation to several specific design choices across the show, including SpongeBob's Pineapple House. Easter Island heads as a visual form had also become, by the time the show launched, a common shorthand in popular culture for something ancient, mysterious, and vaguely imposing, the kind of image that suggests a civilization with pretensions toward permanence and grandeur. Putting Squidward inside one of them, turning a cultural monument into a residence for a character whose defining trait is his conviction of his own superiority, was a choice that landed on multiple levels at once. It gave the character a home that matched his self-image perfectly, and made him look slightly ridiculous in the matching at the same time. The address is documented in the show's own materials. Squidward lives at 122 Conch Street, flanked on one side by SpongeBob's Pineapple at 124, and on the other by Patrick's Rock at 120. The arrangement puts Squidward directly between his two neighbors, in a way that functions almost like a physical description of his situation throughout the series, unable to escape either direction, sandwiched between a level of cheerful enthusiasm he cannot match and a level of cheerful emptiness he cannot escape. the stone monument of his own self-regard, sitting precisely at the center of a neighborhood that does not share his sense of what it represents. The voice actor Roger Bumpus brought his own specific contributions to what the character became, beyond simply delivering dialogue. Bumpus described Squidward's voice as drawing on a combination of influences, a nasal quality he built into the performance that critics over the years compared variously to specific actors and comedic performers with strong opinions and weak social filters. He also contributed a detail to the character's design that made its way into the show quietly and stayed there. Bumpus owns a recumbent bicycle, the kind ridden in a reclining position rather than upright, and he mentioned it during early production conversations. The show incorporated it, and Squidward's recumbent bicycle became a small recurring detail in the series, the kind of specific, unexpected character choice that the show collected in its early years, with the instinct that the more particular a detail is, the funnier and more real it tends to feel. The footstep sounds Squidward makes when he walks are produced by rubbing hot water bottles together, a technique developed by the show's Foley crew to create the specific quality of suction cup on surface movement that an octopus's feet against the ocean floor would theoretically produce. The detail is the kind of thing that never registers consciously for someone watching the show, absorbed instead into the general texture of the audio design, but it represents the same level of care that went into every element of the character, from the visual design outward. The character is wrong at the level of his name, precisely right at the level of his head shape, simplified by 2 limbs for the sake of animation, and given a sound design that tracks what his feet would actually sound like given what he biologically is. The name was chosen for how it sounds, the body for what it communicates, the limbs for what is practical, and the footsteps for what is accurate. All 4 choices made independently, all 4 producing the same character, a creature who is consistently himself, regardless of how many different compromises went into the construction of that self. Squidward the octopus, named after a squid, has been mispronounced as his own species for 25 years by virtually every person who ever watched the show, and the show has never once mentioned it. The joke lives entirely in the gap between what the name says and what the character is, visible only to people who already know what they are looking for, and therefore funniest precisely because the show trusts that most viewers will never look. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The most recognizable name in the show belongs to a creature it does not describe, and that choice was made deliberately by someone who knew exactly what an octopus looked like. Next comes a character whose own name is straightforward enough, but whose presence in Bikini Bottom raises a question the show answered only once, quietly, inside a single line of dialogue that most viewers passed right over. Section 4. The only one who came from above. Every character in Bikini Bottom is from Bikini Bottom. That sounds like a circular statement, but it carries real weight when the full cast is laid out. SpongeBob grew up there, attended school there, built his entire adult life around a restaurant on the same street where he lives. Patrick has apparently never left, his world bounded by Conch Street on one end and Jellyfish Fields on the other, a geography so small that most episodes can cover it on foot in under a minute. Squidward arrived at some point in his past and has been plotting to leave ever since, without ever quite managing it. Mr. Krabs built his business there, and his family history, traced back through the show's various historical episodes, roots him in the same basic geography across multiple generations. Plankton has been there long enough to have a documented rivalry with Mr. Krabs that predates the opening of either of their restaurants. The town is a closed system in most of the ways that matter, populated by creatures who evolved, or mutated, or simply arrived in it at some point before the camera started rolling, and have remained ever since. Sandy Cheeks came from Texas. She came down deliberately, on purpose, as part of a specific scientific mission funded by a group of chimpanzees with English accents who expected results in exchange for their investment. She built an airtight dome on the ocean floor, filled it with a living oak tree and enough air to sustain a terrestrial mammal indefinitely, and established a research station that functioned simultaneously as a home, a laboratory, a gym, and an occasional karate dojo. She is the only main character in the show who is not a sea creature. She is the only one who requires specialized equipment simply to exist in the environment everyone else inhabits without a second thought. And she is the only one whose presence presence in Bikini Bottom has an explanation attached to it, a reason that the show provided once and then never fully elaborated on, leaving the outline of a backstory visible without ever filling it in completely. The episode that introduced her, Tea at the Tree Dome, aired on the same day as the series premiere in May of 1999, making her one of the original pieces of the show's world rather than a later addition. The first thing viewers saw her do was wrestle a giant clam bare-handed, winning the fight without particular difficulty before noticing SpongeBob watching from a safe distance and introducing herself with the casual confidence of someone who had already decided the ocean floor was manageable on her own terms. She invited him in for tea. He, being a sea creature and therefore immediately desiccating in the air-filled dome, was too polite and too impressed to mention that he was dying of thirst, and the episode's central joke played out from there. The introduction did not explain what she was doing underwater, or why a squirrel from Texas had constructed a pressurized habitat on the ocean floor. It simply established that she was there, that she was competent, and that she and SpongeBob were going to be friends. The scientific mission that brought her down was filled in gradually across later episodes, most significantly in Chimps Ahoy from the 4th season, which introduced the 3 chimpanzees who serve as her employers and funding sources. English gentlemen with formal manners and names that sound like characters from a Victorian comedy. They arrived to inspect the inventions Sandy had produced on their behalf and evaluate whether her research program was worth continuing to fund. The episode plays the situation as comedy, built around a close call. Sandy, having spent her time on activities other than the work she was supposed to be doing, and scrambling to produce something impressive before the inspection concluded and her funding was pulled. But the episode's existence confirms something the show had left implicit until that point. Sandy's presence in Bikini Bottom is not permanent in the way that everyone else's presence is. She is there on a contract. She has employers. Her continued residence in the dome is contingent on producing results that satisfy people sitting on the surface who have never visited Bikini Bottom and have no particular feeling about it beyond its utility as a research location. That detail separates her from every other main character in a way that almost never gets discussed, because the show itself does not return to it very often. SpongeBob cannot leave Bikini Bottom in any meaningful sense, because Bikini Bottom is all there is for him. Sandy technically can. Her circumstances in the town are professional rather than existential, which means she is, among all the characters in the central cast, the one whose departure would be most plausibly motivated and most easily explained. The show explored this briefly in the episode Texas, where Sandy grew homesick enough to seriously consider returning to the surface, and SpongeBob and Patrick's efforts to keep her there formed the episode's emotional core. She stayed. But the episode established that staying was a choice she made, rather than a condition she was simply in, and that distinction quietly places her in a different category from her neighbors, even when the show is not actively drawing attention to it. Stephen Hillenburg's decision to include a squirrel in the cast at all came from a specific principle he built the show around from the beginning. Every main character would be a different animal. The core group he assembled covers an enormous range of marine biology, from the microscopic and plankton case to the enormous in pearls, with virtually every major body plan of ocean life represented somewhere in the lineup. Adding a land mammal was a deliberate expansion of that range, a choice to include something that had no natural business being in this environment, so that the show could play with the friction between what Sandy needed to survive and what everyone around her took for granted. The tree dome itself is the physical expression of that friction, a bubble of terrestrial life sitting on the ocean floor, a piece of Texas transplanted to the Pacific and maintained by engineering rather than by any natural compatibility between Sandy's biology and her surroundings. Hillenburg was reportedly specific about where Sandy came from. According to accounts of the show's development, he placed her origin in Houston, a choice that fits her characterization as someone with strong scientific credentials operating in an institutional research context, given Houston's association with NASA and with the kind of large-scale technological infrastructure that supports serious scientific work. The show never states Houston explicitly in the episodes themselves, but the combination of her Texas identity, her scientific expertise, and her employer's expectation that she produce research results with practical applications maps onto that specific kind of Texan scientific culture fairly precisely. Sandy is not simply a squirrel who happens to be smart. She is a squirrel who operates within a recognizable professional framework, one with funders and deliverables, and the ongoing possibility that the project she is working on could be discontinued if it stops producing value. Her areas of expertise across the show's run are genuinely broad and reflect the kind of interdisciplinary range that belongs to a researcher working in a context where the problems being studied do not respect the boundaries between academic disciplines. She is a karate practitioner at a level the show treats as genuinely elite. She is a builder of complex machines and vehicles, including rockets, atmospheric suits, and various transportation devices that have driven episode plots across multiple seasons. She is a scientist whose experiments have, at various points, produced results useful to other characters, endangered other characters, and occasionally destabilized Bikini Bottom itself in ways that required her to step in and reverse the damage. She is a linguist by implication, capable of communicating with species that other characters cannot. She is a rodeo champion. The range is deliberately excessive, the kind of capability list that belongs to a character the writers can drop into any plot and find a plausible role for, which is probably why she is one of the most frequently useful supporting characters across the show's run, even when she is not a main driver of any particular episode's story. The physical design of the tree dome adds details worth noticing beyond its basic function as a pressurized air bubble. It contains a living oak tree at its center, large enough to serve as Sandy's actual residence within the dome, with the dome itself surrounding it like a giant glass terrarium. The tree produces oxygen that supplements whatever Sandy brings in from the surface, or generates through other means, a detail that gives the habitat a kind of ecological self-sufficiency that most cartoon residences do not bother to establish. The dome has a double airlock entry system that allows sea creatures to enter by passing through a chamber that fills with water, preventing the interior air pressure from dropping when the outer door opens. Sandy has, at various points, added a boxing ring, weight equipment, a vehicle garage, an escape pod to Texas that functions as an emergency exit, and various research installations to the dome's interior, making it simultaneously a home, a training facility, and a working laboratory in a space that from the outside looks like a simple glass sphere sitting on the ocean floor. One detail buried in the tree dome's history that receives almost no attention in the episodes themselves is the corporate structure sitting above it. The dome is operated by a company called Tree Dome Enterprises Limited, Sandy's employer's corporate entity, and the chimps who visit in Chimps Ahoy are its board of directors, arriving for a routine inspection. The existence of a corporate ownership structure over Sandy's home means that the place she lives is not technically hers in the way that SpongeBob's Pineapple or Squidward's Stonehead are theirs. Sandy is a tenant in a company-owned research facility, her residency contingent on the continuation of her employment relationship with a board that crosses an ocean and an entire atmospheric boundary to check on her progress. It is one of the stranger living situations in the entire cast, presented with almost no commentary in the episode that introduces it, and never returned to afterward. The nuclear testing theory that links Bikini Bottom's entire population to the real history of Bikini Atoll has a specific provision for Sandy that one Reddit thread identified, and which has circulated in fan discussions since. Among the animals reportedly present on naval vessels during the Operation Crossroads testing series in 1946 were various rodents, brought along as part of the broader scientific program to study the effects of the detonations on animal biology at close range. Sandy, in this reading, is the descendant of one of those animals, her extraordinary intelligence and capability the result of the same radiation that produced talking fish and a sponge who can fry a burger of supernatural quality. The theory cannot be confirmed within the show's own canonical materials, and it functions more as a piece of fan world building than as anything the production ever endorsed. But it has a specific elegance as an explanation for why a squirrel, who is measurably the most scientifically capable character in the show, ended up on the floor of the Pacific Ocean, conducting research for a team of English chimpanzees, her entire professional life pointing back to a question that the show itself never thought to ask out loud. Carolyn Lawrence, who has voiced Sandy since the first episode, came to the role in an unusual way. She was in Los Angeles when she encountered a casting director on a sidewalk, who was there with a mutual acquaintance. The casting director noticed something in her voice, arranged an audition, and Lawrence got the part. She has described her preparation process as one that begins with the storyboards the production sends ahead of each recording session, using the visual material to build an understanding of not just what her lines require, but what the scene's artists had in mind when they drew it. The southern accent Sandy speaks in has been a consistent element of the character from the beginning, a marker of her Texas origin that the show plays both as a source of pride for Sandy and as an occasional source of miscommunication with neighbors who have never been above the surface and have no particular frame of reference for what Texas is or why someone from there might have strong feelings about it. What Sandy represents in the show's larger design is a specific kind of outsider, not hostile or alienated in the way that Plankton's outsider status is built around antagonism and exclusion, but genuinely foreign to the environment in a biological sense, while being socially integrated into Bikini Bottom life in a way that makes her foreignness feel comfortable rather than threatening. She is the character who most consistently reminds viewers that the world the show is set in has a surface above it, a connection to a larger geography that the other characters almost never think about. She is the one who looks up. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The only character in the main cast who came from outside Bikini Bottom brought her own atmosphere with her and built a piece of Texas on the ocean floor. Next comes the voice that opens every episode, the first sound the show ever made, hiding the name of a real person in plain sight across 25 years of broadcasts. Section 5, the voice that opened everything. The first sound in the entire series, setting aside the theme song sung by a pirate over the opening credits, is a French accent. Before SpongeBob speaks, before a single joke lands, before any of the characters who would go on to define the show for 25 years have introduced themselves to anyone watching, a voice arrives from somewhere above the frame, slow and deliberate, and carrying the specific weight of someone who has been observing the ocean for a very long time. The voice describes what it sees. It calls the sea fascinating and wonderful. It locates Bikini Bottom within that sea, describes it as teeming with life, and identifies SpongeBob SquarePants as one of its favorite creatures, before adding, with a tone that sits precisely between warmth and mild condescension, that of course he lives in a pineapple, as though the listener should already know this, and the reminder is being offered as a courtesy rather than an explanation. That voice belongs to a character the show calls the French narrator, a figure who appears on screen only a handful of times across the entire run of the series, almost always heard rather than seen, delivering episode introductions and reading the text cards that mark the passage of time within scenes. He is one of the most frequently heard presences in the show and one of the least examined, a background layer so consistent that it became invisible, something viewers absorbed into the general texture of the experience without registering it as a specific creative choice made by a specific person for a specific reason. The reason is sitting clearly in the original production documents. In the storyboards for Help Wanted, the very first episode, this character was not listed as the French narrator. He was listed simply as Jacques Cousteau. Jacques-Yves Cousteau was a French naval officer, oceanographer, filmmaker, and conservationist who spent roughly 5 decades producing documentary films about the ocean and the creatures living in it. Beginning in the 1940s and continuing until his death in June of 1997, less than 2 years before SpongeBob SquarePants premiered on Nickelodeon. His work, most notably the long-running television series The Undersea World of Jacques Cousteau, which aired across the late 1960s and 1970s, brought the deep ocean into living rooms at a time when most people had no other access to images of what existed below the surface. He had a specific way of speaking about the ocean, slow and reverential and slightly theatrical, as though everything he was describing deserved the weight of language ordinarily reserved for more obviously dramatic subjects. His voice was distinctive enough that it functioned as a kind of signature, immediately recognizable to anyone who had ever watched his films. Steven Hillenburg grew up watching those films. He has said in interviews that Cousteau was one of his idols from childhood, a figure whose work shaped how he thought about the ocean before he ever studied it formally. normally. When Hillenburg was 15 and went snorkeling for the first time at a cove in Laguna Beach, the way he processed that experience was already filtered through what Cousteau had taught him to look for and how Cousteau had taught him to feel about finding it. When Hillenburg began building SpongeBob SquarePants as a world that took the ocean seriously, even while treating it as a stage for cartoon absurdity, Cousteau was the specific imaginative framework he was working inside. The French narrator is the most visible expression of that debt, a character built directly from the voice and manner and self-presentation of the person Hillenburg credited with giving him his love of the underwater world in the first place. The narrator's visual design, on the rare occasions when the show allows him to appear on screen, carries the same direct reference forward into the physical. He is depicted wearing a classic diving suit of the kind associated with early to mid-20th century deep-sea exploration, the bulky pressurized type with a large round helmet that predates the more streamlined equipment modern divers use. On top of that helmet, he wears a red beanie, and this specific detail is not decorative. The red beanie was one of Cousteau's most recognizable personal items, a piece of clothing so consistently associated with him across his decades of public appearances that it functioned as a kind of visual signature, the way certain performers become associated with a specific hat or accessory that gets reproduced in every caricature. When SpongeBob briefly mimics the narrator in the episode Mimic Madness, the impression includes the red beanie, and the face revealed beneath it, carrying a gray goatee and gray hair, echoes Cousteau's own appearance closely enough to be unmistakable for anyone who knows who they are looking at. Tom Kenny, the performer who voices both SpongeBob and the French narrator, approached the two roles as entirely separate vocal performances, which required the kind of range that makes him unusual even within the already specialized world of animation voice acting. The French narrator's voice sits completely apart from SpongeBob's familiar register, slower and deeper, and carrying a different relationship to the pace of speech. The narrator never rushes. He observes and describes with the patience of someone who understands that the ocean moves on its own schedule, and that the person watching it should adjust accordingly. The contrast with SpongeBob's own vocal energy, which is pitched toward excitement and enthusiasm and an almost unlimited capacity for sincerity, is so complete that most viewers have never thought to connect the two performances to the same performer, which is itself a measure of how fully Kenny committed to the distinction. The character exists within the show's world in an unusual way. He is both inside the story and narrating it from outside, a position that gives him access to information the characters themselves do not have, while also placing him in physical proximity to Bikini Bottom, in a way that occasional on-screen appearances make literal. When he does appear visually, he is shown as a diver with a camera, filming the world of the show as though it were a nature documentary he is in the process of making. That framing turns the entire series, retrospectively, into a document being assembled by someone who loves what he is seeing and wants to share it with an audience that might not otherwise know it exists. The show's first words, in this reading, are not an introduction to a cartoon. They are the opening of a nature film, narrated by a man standing in for the person who taught an entire generation to pay attention to what lives in the water. Jacques Cousteau's actual son, Jean-Michel Cousteau, appeared on the DVD release of the first SpongeBob movie in a special feature built around the real marine biology behind the show's characters. A group of scientists enlisted his help to narrate and, in some cases, film genuine sea creatures from the species that inspired the show's cast, drawing the connection between the fictional Bikini Bottom and the actual ocean explicitly through a member of the Cousteau family participating in the project. Jean-Michel Cousteau doing for the DVD release what his father's voice did for every episode of the series, lending the credibility of a specific kind of marine authority to an underwater world that was built partly in that authority's image. The helmet worn by the narrator in his live-action appearances required a performer with very specific physical capabilities, and the casting of that role says something about how seriously the production took even this minor detail. According to the show's crew, a man named Dan Southworth was hired for the live-action portions specifically because of his physical tensile strength. The diving helmet used in the filming weighed approximately 50 pounds on its own, a weight that required the person wearing it to be genuinely capable of supporting it through sustained performance, rather than simply carrying it briefly for a single shot. Southworth has maintained the role across the handful of live-action appearances the narrator makes, including a notable sequence in SpongeBob's Big Birthday Blowout from 2019 that involved a full live-action segment set above the ocean surface. The narrator's function as a timekeeping device across the series is one of his most consistent roles, and one of the most easily overlooked. Throughout the show's run, particularly in the first several seasons when he was used most frequently, the French narrator reads the text cards that appear on screen to mark the passage of time within an episode's story. Cards like 3 hours later, or the next morning, or 1 eternity later are delivered in his specific vocal register, giving even mundane timestamps a quality of weight and consideration they would not carry if the words simply appeared on screen without a voice attached. The show played with this convention often enough that it became a source of jokes in its own right, with certain time cards being so specific or so absurd that the narrator's deadpan delivery of them became the joke, rather than simply the packaging around a different joke. An episode from the second season included a card reading so much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one, followed by a replacement narrator with an English accent reading the same kind of material, a meta joke about the French narrator's role in the show that only works because the audience has by that point absorbed his presence so thoroughly that his temporary absence feels like information. What makes the French narrator specifically worth examining in a video about things most viewers missed is not his existence, which is obvious, but his meaning, which almost nobody who grew up watching the show was in a position to access without knowing something about a French oceanographer who died in 1997. Hillenburg built a tribute to one of his most important personal influences directly into the structure of every episode, in the opening line of every introduction, in the specific timbre and pace of every time card reading, and almost nobody who watched the show in its early years recognized it for what it was. Children watching in 1999 heard a funny French accent and moved on to whatever SpongeBob was going to do next. Adults watching alongside them heard the same accent and registered it as atmosphere rather than biography. The joke, if it can be called that, or the tribute, which is probably the more accurate word, was available only to people who had already spent enough time with Cousteau's own work to hear what the show was doing when it set his voice at the opening of its world. Cousteau died on June 25, 1997, at the age of 87 in Paris. The timeline of SpongeBob's development puts Hillenburg deep in the process of creating the show at that point, working through the pitch materials and early character designs that would eventually be presented to Nickelodeon. The French narrator as a creative choice was taking shape at almost exactly the moment the real man whose voice and manner inspired it ceased to exist, and the show that premiered 2 years later carried that inspiration forward for the next quarter century, speaking the ocean's praises in a borrowed accent every time a new episode began, a quiet and ongoing act of acknowledgement from a marine biologist turned animator who never seems to have thought that a show built around talking sea creatures needed to choose between being funny and remembering where its deepest affections came from. The show's own storyboards named him outright Jacques Cousteau, not a character based on Jacques Cousteau or inspired by Jacques Cousteau. Jacques Cousteau, labeled clearly in the production document for the first episode ever made, as though the creator simply wrote the name of the person he had in mind and handed it to the animators to build from. The name was changed before the show reached broadcast, replaced with the more generic French narrator, to avoid complications that would come with using a real person's name in perpetuity across a commercial television series. But the original label survived in the production materials, and it was captured in the documentary Square Roots, The Story of SpongeBob SquarePants, where footage of the early storyboard pages was included in the film. Anyone watching that documentary closely enough to read the handwriting on those boards found Jacques Cousteau's name written in plain text, the ghost of the original intention still visible in the document that preceded everything else. He opens every episode. He has opened them since May 1st, 1999. He will open them for as long as the show continues to exist in any form. The first words of SpongeBob SquarePants belong to a man in a red beanie who loved the ocean and spent spent his life trying to show other people what was living inside it, speaking in the voice of someone who thought the sea was worth the time it took to look at carefully. Hillenburg thought so too. He just expressed it differently. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The voice that opened the show was built from the life of a real oceanographer, placed there by a man who trained as a marine biologist before he ever touched an animation desk. Next comes the most recognizable house in the show's history, and the specific personal reason its creator chose a pineapple over every other shape he could have drawn. Section 6. Why a pineapple? Most cartoon characters live somewhere that makes immediate sense. A mouse lives in a mouse hole. A bear lives in a cave, or a house, designed to communicate something specific about his relationship to comfort and food. The home is an extension of the character, a readable shorthand that tells the audience something about who they are dealing with before a single line of dialogue has been spoken. When Hillenburg sat down to design the street where SpongeBob and his neighbors would spend most of their lives, he was working from that same basic principle. But the specific choices he made were rooted in something more personal and more geographically specific than simple cartoon logic. And the pineapple in particular came from a place in his thinking that required more than one step to arrive at. Hillenburg has described the process of designing the Conch Street houses as a kind of free association exercise, working through the question of what kinds of structures could plausibly exist on an ocean floor, and which of those structures would best communicate each character's personality before anyone had even met them. He sketched multiple possibilities, pulling from natural objects, man-made debris that might have sunk to the bottom of the Pacific, and cultural visual traditions that felt consistent with the aesthetic world he was trying to build. What drove the pineapple specifically, according to his own account, was its recurrence in Polynesian visual culture, the tradition of fabric design and decorative art from the Pacific Island communities whose aesthetic Hillenburg drew on heavily when constructing the look and feel of Bikini Bottom as a place. The show's overall visual design carries Polynesian influence throughout, in the flower-covered clouds visible above the waterline in the opening sequence, in the general palette of warm colors and organic shapes that define the backgrounds, in the specific cultural reference embedded in Squidward's Easter Island head house. Pineapples appear repeatedly in Polynesian textile and decorative arts as a motif, and Hillenburg, who had spent years studying and teaching about Pacific Ocean ecology and who had a deep familiarity with the cultures of the region surrounding the waters he loved, recognized the pineapple as something that belonged visually in the world he was building. When he drew it among the possible houses and looked at it sitting on the ocean floor, it fit. It felt like something that could have arrived there and stayed, both natural and slightly absurd in exactly the proportion the show required. The question of which character got which house was settled by a piece of reasoning that Hillenburg described in terms that say something specific about how he understood SpongeBob as a personality. He imagined laying out the options on the ocean floor and asking which one SpongeBob would choose. A rock was available, an Easter Island head was available, an old rubber boot was apparently in the mix as well, and the pineapple was there. Hillenburg's answer to his own question was that SpongeBob would choose the pineapple because SpongeBob is an optimist, and an optimist would be drawn to something bright and warm and tropical smelling. He specifically noted that SpongeBob would like the smell. The rock went to Patrick, fitting for a character whose inner life is largely invisible from the outside, and who seems perfectly comfortable with whatever he has landed on. The Easter Island head went to Squidward, fitting for a character who considers himself a monument to his own refinement. The pineapple went to SpongeBob because it was the warmest, most welcoming choice available, and that quality matched its occupant precisely. The specific pineapple sitting at 124 Conch Street has an origin story inside the show's own continuity that the series provided once and never really returned to. The TV special Truth or Square, a 10th anniversary production that framed itself as a documentary about the show's history, included a segment establishing that SpongeBob's pineapple house arrived on the ocean floor when it fell from a ship passing overhead. A sequence showed the pineapple dropping through the water column and landing on the ocean floor, where it apparently took root, hollowed itself out, and became inhabitable in the way that things in Bikini Bottom become what the story needs them to be without requiring extensive explanation. Whether that origin is canonical in any strict sense, or simply a piece of anniversary special mythology, is the kind of question the show's relationship to its own continuity makes essentially unanswerable. The show has also shown the pineapple being eaten on multiple occasions, and then rebuilt, and then eaten again, suggesting the house exists in a state of ongoing replacement, rather than as a single continuous structure with a single unbroken history. What the house looks like from the outside, across most of the series, is a tall, golden-orange pineapple with 10 green leaves fanning out from the top. 5 porthole-style windows visible across the exterior, a front door centered in the lower section, and various flowers arranged around the base. The address, 124 Conch Street, appears on official materials and episode props. The house has a chimney. It has a garage visible at the back in some episodes. It has a grassy rooftop terrace accessible through a hatch in the top, hidden within the crown of leaves, which SpongeBob climbs to in episodes that require him to be above the main structure for one reason or another. The interior is substantially larger than the exterior would suggest, a standard cartoon convention that the show deploys without comment, meaning the kitchen, living room, library, bedroom, bathroom, and various other rooms that have appeared across different episodes all fit inside a pineapple that from the outside looks like it could plausibly hold one medium-sized room and very little else. A mathematician and science communicator named Vi Hart published a video in 2012 examining whether the pineapple in SpongeBob was mathematically accurate as a pineapple. Her analysis concluded that it was not. Real pineapples grow with a specific spiral pattern on their exterior surface, a pattern governed by the same Fibonacci sequence that appears in sunflower seeds and nautilus shells and various other natural growth structures. The pineapple in SpongeBob does not follow that pattern. Its exterior is a regular diamond grid rather than the offset spiraling arrangement of a real fruit. Hart's video caught the attention of a show artist named Kenny Pittenger, who took the analysis seriously enough that it led to a slight redesign of the house's exterior pattern shortly after the video circulated. The revision brought the show's pineapple closer to mathematical reality without making it fully accurate, a compromise between what a real pineapple looks like and what the established design of the house required. The change was subtle enough that most viewers watching after the revision never noticed anything had shifted. Inside the house, the design follows SpongeBob's personality as directly as the choice of exterior shape did. The furniture is ocean-themed throughout, built from shells and natural materials, in the way that the furnishings of Bikini Bottom, broadly, are built from whatever the sea provides, and whatever has sunk from the surface world above. The living room contains a couch, a television, and various decorative elements that reflect SpongeBob's specific enthusiasms, including his collection of Krabby Patty memorabilia, and the various objects that accumulate around a character whose attachment to things is emotional rather than curated. The bedroom contains a bed shaped like a boat, which sits in an interesting relationship to the show's broader visual language around water transportation, since the boats of Bikini Bottom function as cars function in surface world media, driven on underwater roads, parked outside buildings, subject to traffic laws enforced by the Bikini Bottom police. A bed shaped like a boat in that context is roughly equivalent to a surface world child sleeping in a bed shaped like a car, a specific kind of enthusiast's bedroom decor that communicates something about what the sleeper thinks about when they are awake. The pineapple's color changes between day and night in the show's visual design, shifting from its standard warm golden orange to a deep blue in nighttime scenes, a background detail that belongs to the category of things most viewers absorb without registering, rather than things they consciously notice. The house's general appearance has also been revised slightly across the seasons, the shift between Hillenburg's original design era and later production periods visible in the backgrounds to viewers who have watched closely enough across enough episodes to notice the difference in style. The walls of the house reveal an additional detail in the episode Pineapple Invasion. What appears to be a sandy floor inside is actually a type of carpet covering blue metal plating, a discovery that briefly reframes the interior's apparently organic ocean floor quality as a design surface installed over a more structured substrate. One episode revealed something living inside the walls of the house itself, a development that generated significant fan discussion when it aired. Walhalla introduced a character named Wally, an old man who had been living inside the walls of SpongeBob's pineapple for an unspecified number of years without SpongeBob's knowledge. Wally had built his own small residence within the wall structure of the house, using the space between the pineapple's exterior and its interior rooms as a hidden dwelling. The episode treated this as comedy rather than horror, but the implication that SpongeBob had been unknowingly sharing his home with another occupant for potentially the entire run of the show opened a perspective on the pineapple as a space that the earlier designs had never fully accounted for. The episode Truth or Square also contained a segment revealing that there is a dinosaur skeleton buried directly beneath the foundation of SpongeBob's house, a detail that arrives in the episode without explanation and departs the same way, adding another layer to the ground the pineapple is sitting on without clarifying how a dinosaur skeleton came to be on the floor of the Pacific Ocean or why it chose this particular spot. Bikini Bottom as an environment has been consistently established across the show's run as a place built on top of a great deal of hidden history, its suburban normalcy resting on strata of stranger, older things that occasionally surface in the form of a joke and then return to invisibility. The house was designed for one specific character in a moment of creative free association by a man who was imagining what a cheerful, smell-appreciating optimist would choose if offered a rock, a monument, and a tropical fruit. The specific cultural tradition the fruit came from was the same Pacific Island tradition that gave the show its overall visual identity, which connected back to the geographic reality of Bikini Atoll and the Marshall Islands region that gave the show its setting and its name. The pineapple on the ocean floor is, in this chain, the most personal and most geographically rooted design choice in the entire show's visual vocabulary. An image from Polynesian fabric design redrawn as a cartoon house and placed at the center of a world that was built on a Pacific coordinate chosen by a marine biologist who understood exactly where he was putting it. SpongeBob chose it because he liked the smell. That was the reason his creator gave, and it was probably also the truest one available. An optimist, given a choice of dwellings on an ocean floor, picks the warmest and most welcoming option, the one that smells like somewhere good. Everything else, the cultural history, the mathematical spiral, the hidden resident in the walls, the dinosaur skeleton underneath, the blue metal floor beneath the carpet, accumulates around a decision that was made first on the basis of what the character would feel drawn toward, and the rest of the details moved in after. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The pineapple was chosen because an optimist would pick the one that smells like somewhere good, and everything else built up around that single piece of character logic. Next comes a character who was never meant to be more than a background detail and became one of the show's 10 main characters entirely because children decided he mattered more than the writers had planned. Section 7. The snail who was never supposed to matter. There is a character that appears in almost every long-running animated series, one that the writers include initially as a background detail, a piece of set dressing that adds texture to a scene without being expected to carry any weight on its own. These characters exist to fill space, to give the main character something to interact with in a moment that would otherwise be too empty, to establish that a fictional home contains more than just its owner. They are designed for function rather than personality, and the expectation is that they will remain in that functional role indefinitely, noticed only by attentive viewers, and never given enough screen time to develop into something the writers have to account for. Gary the Snail was supposed to be exactly that kind of character, and what happened instead tells a story about how the audience for a show can quietly redirect its own creative direction by simply caring more about something than the people who made it expected anyone to. Steven Hillenburg introduced Gary in the show's series Bible, the foundational document that lays out the premise, the characters, and the basic rules of the world for the network's benefit before production begins. In that document, Gary was not a character in any meaningful sense. He was a thing in SpongeBob's house. Hillenburg's description placed him alongside alongside a singing clam named Shelly as one of SpongeBob's pets, background objects rather than participants, there to fill out the pineapple's interior and give SpongeBob something to move around without generating any story of their own. The idea was that it would be funny if SpongeBob kept a meowing snail and a singing clam as household companions, a joke built from the incongruity of the animals involved, rather than from any quality attached to the animals themselves. Neither pet was intended to speak in any meaningful sense, to develop preferences or relationships or an interior life visible to the viewer, or to appear outside the occasional glance and move on context of SpongeBob's bedroom scenes. Shelly the Scallop followed the trajectory the writers had planned. The clam remained a background detail across the show's run, appearing occasionally as a prop in SpongeBob's home, without ever generating the kind of attention that would have pushed the writers to develop the character further. Gary did not follow that trajectory at all. Somewhere in the production of the first season, the writing team found that Gary was more useful than they had anticipated, that there were more things they could do with a pet snail than simply have him sit in the corner meowing while SpongeBob got ready for work. The specific quality that turned out to be generative was the same quality that makes the character funny on first viewing and genuinely affecting on any viewing after that. Gary communicates an enormous amount through a single sound, and the gap between how limited that sound is and how clearly his meaning comes through in context is one of the most consistently reliable comic and emotional resources in the show's entire toolkit. The meow is the center of everything Gary became, and it arrived from a piece of world building that the show established early and maintained with surprising consistency across its entire run. In the world of Bikini Bottom, snails are the underwater equivalent of cats, and sea worms are the underwater equivalent of dogs. This rule is never stated explicitly in any episode as a piece of formal information delivered to the audience. It is simply true, consistently and throughout, visible in the way characters relate to snails, in the way snails behave, and in the sounds they make. Gary meows because cats meow, and Gary is a snail in an underwater world where snails occupy the social and domestic role that cats occupy in the world above the surface. Sea worms bark for the same reason. The system is clean and complete and requires no explanation because it announces itself through behavior rather than exposition, which is exactly how the best world building tends to work. Tom Kenny performs the meow, which is worth noting because Kenny is also the voice of SpongeBob, meaning the show's central human relationship, the one between SpongeBob and his pet, is performed by a single actor, doubling against himself. The meow Kenny delivers for Gary is not a simple animal sound. It shifts in pitch, duration, and emotional register across different scenes in ways that carry clear meaning to SpongeBob within the scene and to the audience watching it. A short, flat meow communicates something different from a drawn-out, slightly mournful one. A sharp, startled meow that transitions into something resembling a hiss communicates something different again. The range within what is technically a single sound is wide enough that long-term viewers develop an intuitive fluency with it, understanding what Gary means in context without consciously analyzing the performance. It is a considerable vocal achievement that gets almost no recognition, because the mode it operates in is one that rewards subtlety rather than conspicuous effort. Gary was formally promoted to the show's main character sheet in the second season, making him the first character to be elevated from the background to the primary cast after the show began airing. The decision was driven by two forces that rarely aligned so cleanly. The writing team had discovered, across the first season, that they could use Gary in ways they had not anticipated, building episodes around his relationship with SpongeBob that generated both comedy and something closer to genuine emotional stakes than a background prop should technically be capable of generating. And Nickelodeon's marketing team had discovered independently that Gary was connecting with young viewers in a way that went well beyond what the character's planned role should have produced, emerging in their assessment as what they described as an unsung hero of the show's cast in terms of audience affinity. The writers were finding him useful, and the audience was finding him meaningful, and those two discoveries together made the promotion essentially inevitable. The episode that most clearly demonstrates what Gary was capable of once the writers committed to taking him seriously is Have You Seen This Snail?, a 22-minute special from the 5th season in which SpongeBob becomes so absorbed in a paddleball challenge that he forgets to feed Gary for 10 days. Gary, hungry and feeling genuinely neglected, leaves home. The episode follows both SpongeBob's increasingly frantic search for his missing pet and Gary's own journey through Bikini Bottom, during which he is taken in by an elderly woman who offers him abundant food and apparent affection, but turns out to have a history of adopting snails and feeding them until they are too heavy to move, at which point the snail disappears and she moves on to the next one. The implication of what happens to the previous snails is left to the audience's imagination, and the show handles it with exactly the degree of ambiguity that allows younger viewers to read it as simply a sad situation, while older viewers recognize a considerably darker possibility. The sequence of Gary walking alone through Bikini Bottom, hungry and confused, looking for somewhere to go after leaving the only home he has known, is scored and paced in a way that belongs to a different emotional register than almost anything else the show produced in its early and middle seasons. A song written for the episode, performed as a solo by SpongeBob once he realizes what his neglect has cost him, is one of the most earnest pieces of music the show ever produced, stripped of the ironic distance that usually keeps the show's more sentimental moments from feeling unguarded. The combination of the song, the visual of Gary wandering alone, and the episode's emotional resolution produced a response from the audience that the show rarely generated for stories about its background characters, and it confirmed that whatever Gary had become in the years since the series Bible described him as a thing in SpongeBob's house, he had traveled very far from that starting point. Gary's intelligence, which the show raises and then sets aside, and then raises again across the series without ever fully committing to a consistent position on how smart he actually is, generates its own pattern of hidden detail for viewers paying close attention. In the episode Sleepy Time, SpongeBob enters the dreams of the characters around him and finds within Gary's dream a library, with Gary himself in a robe, reading, speaking full sentences in a low and cultivated voice that shares almost nothing with the meow of his waking life. The dream version of Gary tells SpongeBob, with some asperity, that he did not think his shell was full of hot air, a remark that implies Gary has been aware of being underestimated and has opinions about it that his single available sound does not allow him to express in waking life. The episode's framing keeps this contained within the dream logic that all of SpongeBob's dream visits operate within, but it left a specific impression on viewers that the subsequent seasons occasionally reinforced. Gary has a library card. Gary has demonstrated the ability to drive a boat more safely than SpongeBob after years of watching Mrs. Puff fail to teach his owner the same skill. Gary has a record player under his shell, along with a diamond, SpongeBob's favorite novelty shirt, and enough additional objects that the shell functions as a kind of personal storage unit whose contents reveal a sensibility the meow alone would never communicate. The shell itself carries an additional layer of detail that a later episode introduced without any particular fanfare. The episode Shell Games revealed that Patrick's rock, long established as simply the stone his neighbor lives under, is actually the shell of a sea turtle named Tony, who had been asleep for over 30 years beneath an accumulated coating of dirt and sediment that made his shell look like an ordinary rock. The detail reframed not just Patrick's house, but the broader principle of Bikini Bottom's architecture, the idea that what looks like one thing from the outside may be something quite different when the full history of the object is known. Gary's shell follows a similar principle, its exterior presenting as a simple spiral housing, while its interior apparently contains far more than the volume of the shell would suggest. Stuffed with objects that accumulate across episodes, and collectively describe a snail with a richer inner life than his public-facing sound ever makes visible. The specific equivalence between snails and cats in the show's internal logic extends into details the show laid out across seasons for anyone tracking them. Sea worms keep their owners the way dogs dogs keep theirs, loyal and responsive in the ways dogs are loyal and responsive. Snails occupy the position cats occupy, with all the independence and opacity that comes with that position. The show even established an equivalent to cat shows in the episode The Great Snail Race, where Squidward enters his pedigree snail Snelly in a formal racing competition against Gary and a snail belonging to a background character, a premise that works only because the audience has by that point absorbed the snail as cat parallel well enough to recognize a cat show when the show stages one with snails instead. The race produces one of the more physically uncomfortable sequences in the show's run, as SpongeBob's intense coaching of Gary pushes the snail toward injury, before Snelly, recognizing what is happening, stops competing to help Gary. A moment of cross-species affection that lands with the same straightforward sentiment the show was capable of when it chose to step outside its usual ironic frame. What Gary became over the course of the show's run is something the series Bible never anticipated, and the writers could not have planned, which is a character whose silence is louder than most other characters' full vocabulary. The meow communicates, SpongeBob understands it, and the audience develops its own understanding through the same process of repeated exposure and contextual inference. A character who cannot speak in any conventional sense turns out to be among the most emotionally legible in the cast. His meaning carried not by words, but by timing, by the physical expressiveness of his eyes, and by the accumulated weight of 25 years of the audience learning his language, whether they meant to or not. He was supposed to be a thing in a bedroom. He became one of 10. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A background detail that children decided to love became one of the show's 10 main characters, promoted by an audience that understood him before the writers did. Next comes the character who was added to the cast specifically because of a request the creator did not want to honor, and who ended up becoming one of the most quietly dark figures in the show's entire history. Section 8. The Teacher Who Preferred Prison. Every character in the main cast of SpongeBob SquarePants exists because Steven Hillenburg wanted them there. The specific animals, the specific personalities, the specific roles each character plays in the world of Bikini Bottom all trace back to decisions Hillenburg made deliberately, drawing on his marine biology background, his personal history, and the internal logic of the world he was assembling. There is one exception to that pattern. One main character in the show exists not because Hillenburg wanted to create her, but because Nickelodeon wanted something the show did not have, and Hillenburg found a way to provide it that preserved the things he cared about protecting while giving the network what it was asking for. The compromise produced one of the strangest, most quietly troubled figures in the entire cast, a character whose surface role is simple and whose actual history, assembled across decades of small revelations scattered through different episodes, is considerably darker than anything the show ever chose to make explicit. Nickelodeon's request was straightforward. They wanted SpongeBob to attend school. This was a standard instinct for a network running children's programming, built on the reasonable assumption that putting a main character in a school environment gives writers a reliable, relatable setting that young viewers can connect to their own lives. School episodes generate conflict naturally, provide built-in authority figures, and create a recurring structure that writers can return to without needing to reinvent the premise each time. For a network developing a new animated series aimed at children, asking for a school felt obvious. Hillenburg's resistance was equally straightforward. He had conceived SpongeBob as an adult. The character had a job, a home, a pet, and a social life built around adult concerns like employment and neighborly conflict. Putting him in school would complicate that adult identity in ways that Hillenburg felt would undermine what made the character work. He did not want SpongeBob to be a child or a student in the conventional sense, and he was apparently firm enough about this that a direct school setting was off the table. What he offered instead was a compromise that preserved his vision while technically satisfying what the network had asked for. SpongeBob would attend school, but the school would be a boating school, school rather than an academic one, the kind of functional adult education context where a grown person learning to drive was entirely plausible. And the teacher at that school would be a new character built specifically for the role. The character Hillenburg designed to fill that role was Mrs. Puff, and the design process for her was driven by the same instinct for visual comedy that produced the lobster trap shape of the Krusty Krab. He chose a pufferfish for her species because of a specific physical property of pufferfish that translated directly into a running visual gag. Pufferfish inflate when threatened or frightened, swelling their bodies dramatically as a defense mechanism against predators. In Mrs. Puff's case, the show established that she inflates whenever SpongeBob crashes the boat during a driving lesson, which happens in virtually every lesson he has ever taken with her. The inflation is the punchline made visible, the physical expression of her stress response to an event that has become the defining, repeated catastrophe of her professional life. Hillenburg noted that the inflating teacher matched the visual of a car's airbag deploying, a small joke built into the character's biology that plays out every single time SpongeBob puts the boat into a wall, or a building, or another vehicle, or occasionally just an open stretch of water. The June 2003 issue of Nickelodeon magazine, in a story covering the show's origins, confirmed that Mrs. Puff was the last main character added to the cast. She appears in the show's third draft of the pitch Bible, not the first two, indicating that she was a late addition to the lineup rather than part of the original core conception. Hillenburg has said that while the compromise was not what he originally wanted, it produced a character he came to genuinely value, a new dynamic that the show would not have found otherwise. He described Mrs. Puff as bringing an aspect to the show he would never have reached without the network's initial request, which is one of the more generous assessments of a creative constraint that any showrunner has offered in discussing the development of their work. What Hillenburg built once he committed to the character was not a simple authority figure designed to bounce off SpongeBob's enthusiasm. Mrs. Puff has a history, and the history is strange. The show revealed it in fragments across seasons, rather than in any single dedicated episode, dropping small pieces of information in moments that feel almost accidental, as though the writers were building a picture they never intended to complete. What emerges from those fragments is a character whose life before Bikini Bottom involved circumstances dark enough that she left them behind entirely, arriving in the town with a new name, a new school, and a clear determination to put whatever came before at a sufficient distance that it would never catch up with her. The name itself is where the strangeness begins. Mrs. Puff is a title and a surname, but the episodes that touch on her past suggest it may not be the name she was born with. A fan-made analysis of the episode Lighthouse Louie, in which SpongeBob cleans out Mrs. Puff's lighthouse and discovers a newspaper from her previous city, identified what appears to be a photograph that does not match her current appearance, alongside text suggesting she was known by a different identity in a previous life. The episode Doing Time, which features a flashback to Mrs. Puff opening her boating school in Bikini Bottom, includes a line in which she pledges that as long as a student is willing to learn, she will never give up, a pledge phrased specifically around the word new in relation to the school, implying this was not her first attempt at running a boating school, and that something ended the previous attempt in a way she was determined to avoid repeating. The precise nature of what happened before Bikini Bottom has never been stated directly by the show, leaving the outline of something significant without filling it in. Her criminal record is the most thoroughly documented aspect of her dark history, because unlike her pre-Bikini Bottom past, it plays out entirely on-screen across episodes that span the full run of the series. Mrs. Puff has been arrested and jailed more than 15 times across the show's history, according to records maintained by fans tracking each documented incident. The majority of these arrests are directly caused by SpongeBob's behavior during driving lessons, which results in property damage and public endangerment on a scale that the Bikini Bottom legal system apparently holds his teacher responsible for, rather than the student behind the wheel. She has been sentenced to jail time in Hall Monitor, jailed again after a different SpongeBob disaster in Doing Time, violated parole in Bumper to Bumper, been arrested in connection with a boat theft she committed herself in No Free Rides, and been taken in under a case of mistaken identity in Patrick Man. The pattern is consistent and cumulative, her record growing longer with each season, while her teaching credentials somehow remain intact. The episode No Free Rides reveals something about about Mrs. Puff's character that the show usually keeps below the surface of her more straightforwardly comedic reactions. Faced with the prospect of spending another year teaching SpongeBob because he has again failed his driving exam, she gives him a passing grade without actually testing him, a decision she immediately regrets when she imagines the consequences of an incompetent driver with a legal license loose in Bikini Bottom. What she does next is the moment the episode earns. She disguises herself, steals the boat SpongeBob has been given as a reward for passing, and attempts to disappear with it, reasoning that if the boat does not exist, SpongeBob cannot drive it, and her credentials cannot be held responsible for what he does with it. The plan fails, as her plans always fail, but the fact that she formulated and executed it at all places her in a specific category that most children's cartoon teachers never occupy. She is a person who has weighed her options and concluded that committing a crime was more defensible than continuing her legitimate professional obligations. The show plays this as comedy, and it is funny, but the shape underneath the comedy is genuinely bleak. The Doing Time episode goes further still in what it reveals about her relationship to her own situation. After yet another SpongeBob disaster lands her in jail, Mrs. Puff discovers that she likes it there. The quiet of the prison yard, the structured routine, the absence of a yellow sponge anywhere in her immediate environment. All of it amounts to something she experiences not as punishment, but as relief. When SpongeBob and Patrick attempt to break her out of prison because they believe she wants to leave, she is horrified. She actively resists the rescue. She would rather stay in the institution that the legal system built to contain people who have broken the law than return to the life that is technically her real one. The show does not linger on this implication, moving through it at the pace of comedy rather than of genuine psychological examination, but it is visible for anyone watching with enough attention. A character who prefers incarceration to her ordinary existence is communicating something specific about the condition of that ordinary existence. Mr. Puff, the husband Mrs. Puff never discusses, and whose fate the show revealed in a single brief scene in the episode Krusty Love, adds the final layer to her backstory. When Mr. Krabs begins showing romantic interest in Mrs. Puff, and wonders why she carries a title suggesting she is or was married, SpongeBob explains that Mr. Puff is no longer around, and the show cuts away briefly to the surface world, where a human hand reaches out and switches on a lamp made from a dried pufferfish. Mr. Puff was caught, killed, and turned into a novelty item, the kind sold in tourist shops in coastal towns as a piece of decorative ocean curiosity. The scene is played without any emotional weight, moving past it before the gravity of the information can settle. But it is there. Mrs. Puff's husband was made into a lamp. She does not like to talk about it. She has since been cautiously dating a crab who owns a fast food restaurant on the same street as her school, and whatever she carries from the loss of Mr. Puff, she carries quietly. Hillenburg described his retrospective appreciation for the character in terms that suggest he recognized what the compromise had produced, even if he had not originally set out to produce it. In 2012, looking back on the decision to create Mrs. Puff, he said she had brought a new aspect to the show, and that he would never have found it without the constraint that forced him there. The character who emerged from that constraint is a pufferfish with a hidden past, a criminal record longer than most actual criminals on the show, a preference for prison over teaching, a dead husband made into household decor, and a professional relationship with her most persistent student that has produced more personal catastrophe than any other single relationship in her life. She is the most consistent and thoroughly unfortunate character in the main cast, absorbing damage across every season without ever quite breaking, and she exists entirely because Nickelodeon wanted a school. The compromise Hillenburg offered gave the network what it asked for, and gave the show something it would not otherwise have had: a character whose situation was genuinely dire, in ways that comedy could circle around without ever fully resolving, because the resolution would require SpongeBob to pass his driving test, and according to the rules the show established for itself early on, that is not something that is allowed to happen. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The character added, as a compromise to satisfy a network request, became one of the show's most quietly troubled figures. Her backstory assembled from fragments across decades. Next comes the villain's wife, a character named after a real person who was originally supposed to voice her and could not get a single line out on recording day. Section 9. The computer named after a real person. There is a character in Bikini Bottom who has never had a body in the conventional sense, who exists primarily as a screen mounted on a wall in a restaurant that nobody wants to eat at, who has been described by one of the show's longtime performers as the smartest resident in the entire underwater city, and whose name was taken directly from a real woman living in Southern California who was supposed to voice the character herself, and found, when the moment arrived, that she could not do it. The character is Karen, Plankton's computer wife, and the story of how she got her name and her voice is one of the more personal details embedded anywhere in the show's history. A small act of tribute from a creator to the person he had apparently decided was funnier than anyone else he knew. Steven Hillenburg named the character after his wife, Karen Hillenburg, born Karen Umland. He has been quoted describing her as the funniest person he knows, and according to accounts of how Karen the character's personality was developed, her specific brand of sarcasm was the quality Hillenburg was drawing on when he built the cartoon version. Karen the computer is sharper than Plankton in most of the ways that matter for their partnership, quicker to identify the flaw in a plan, more consistently accurate in her assessments of his chances, and more straightforwardly honest about the gap between his self-image and his actual capabilities. The sarcasm is not cruel exactly, but it is consistent and well-aimed, the kind that belongs to someone who has watched the same patterns repeat often enough to have developed a specific economy of words around pointing them out. Hillenburg saw that quality in his wife and built a supercomputer villain out of it. The original plan, before production began on Karen's first episode, was for Karen Hillenburg to provide the voice herself. The logic was clean. The character was named after her, built in part around her personality, and placing her actual voice inside the character would have completed the connection in a way that felt personally meaningful to the creator. Hillenburg arranged for her to come in and record, and the session was scheduled. On the day of the recording, Karen Hillenburg was too nervous to produce a single usable line. The accounts of what happened describe her as being so overwhelmed by the experience of sitting in a professional recording studio trying to perform dialogue as a character that the performance itself became impossible. She could not get through it. The session ended without anything being committed to tape that could be used in the show. The production needed a voice, and the search for a replacement led to Jill Talley, who got the role and has held it ever since. What makes the casting of Jill Talley specifically interesting, beyond her performance, which is the thing most directly responsible for who Karen became as a character across the show's run, is a biographical detail that creates its own small symmetry inside the show's production. Jill Talley is married to Tom Kenny. Tom Kenny is the voice of SpongeBob. The result is that the two married characters at the center of the show's villain dynamic, Plankton voiced by Doug Lawrence and Karen voiced by Jill Talley, are performed by two people, while the main character who opposes them is voiced by the husband of one of the performers playing those villains. The recording booth for SpongeBob SquarePants was, during the years when Talley was most active in the role, a space where a married couple were simultaneously voicing characters on opposite sides of the show's central conflict without either of those characters being aware of the other's existence. Karen's character in the early episodes was considerably less developed than the version most viewers are familiar with from later seasons. In the first episode she appeared in, simply titled Plankton, she functioned primarily as an analytical tool rather than a personality, a computer that processed information and reported findings without the sardonic self-awareness that would come to define her later. The episode used her to scan SpongeBob and produce a readout of his psychological vulnerabilities, a scene that plays as pure functional plot delivery, the computer doing what computers are supposed to do rather than what Karen in her later form would do. Even in that early version, the show found one small moment of characterization. The readout she delivers, describing Plankton as being composed of 99% hot gas and 1% evil. A line aimed at her own husband with a precision that hints at what the character would eventually become once the writers committed to developing her beyond her initial function. The decision to make Karen Plankton's wife, rather than simply his computer, was not part of the original conception. Hillenburg's series Bible described her as Plankton's computer assistant, a working relationship rather than a domestic one, a tool he had built and operated rather than a partner he had married and argued with over the dinner table he did not have because his restaurant had no customers to serve at it. Doug Lawrence, who voices Plankton and has written for the character since the show's earliest seasons, was the person who pushed the relationship in the direction it eventually took. Lawrence has said in interviews that he found the idea of an evil genius's marriage to be the funniest possible version of Plankton's domestic situation, and that once he started developing the dynamic between Plankton and Karen as a genuinely married couple rather than an inventor and his machine, the comedic possibilities expanded in ways the more purely functional version would never have reached. The transition from computer assistant to wife happened gradually, rather than in a single declared moment. In the first 3 seasons, the show's official materials described Karen in professional rather than personal terms. Plankton's official biography from the year 2000 stating simply that he worked with the help of his computer, Karen, without any suggestion of a marital relationship. The 3rd season episode, The Algae's Always Greener, which aired in 2002, was the first instance in which Plankton referred to Karen as his wife within the dialogue of an episode, a shift that the subsequent seasons built on extensively, developing their marriage as one of the show's recurring comic dynamics through episodes focused on anniversaries, honeymoons that never happened, arguments about credit and recognition, and occasional moments of something closer to genuine affection that the show treated with the same combination of sincerity and irony it applied to its more straightforwardly emotional storylines. Karen's physical form changed significantly between the show's early seasons and its later ones, a development driven by the practical demands of storytelling rather than any change in the character's internal logic. In the first 3 seasons and the first theatrical film, Karen existed almost entirely as an immobile monitor screen, permanently attached to the wall of the Chumbucket laboratory. This form limited what the writers could do with her, since a character who cannot leave a single room can only participate in stories that take place in that room, or that bring other characters to her. Starting with the first SpongeBob movie in 2004, the character was given what the show describes as a mobile form, a portable wheeled computer with detachable robotic arms capable of moving through Bikini Bottom independently and interacting with characters and locations outside the Chumbucket. The mobile form became her dominant mode in later seasons, freeing her from the laboratory and allowing the writers to place her in episode plots that would have been impossible when she was wall-mounted. The name Karen appears on merchandise and promotional materials for the show, sometimes spelled out as an acronym, rendered as K-A-R-E-N, with periods between each letter in the way that technology from a certain era of science fiction was habitually given acronym names to suggest sophisticated engineering. This appears to be a fan and merchandise convention rather than something the show itself established as canonical, the letters filling in retroactively around an existing name, the way people tend to find patterns in things that were not originally designed to contain them. The actual name has no acronym history in the show's production. It is simply the name of the creator's wife, placed on a cartoon computer in an act of personal tribute, and then surrounded over the years by the standard machinery of franchise branding that turns proper nouns into merchandise-ready assets. Tom Kenny, when asked in a 2004 interview about Karen's ability to function underwater as a computer, gave an answer that has been quoted repeatedly because of how precisely it captures something true about how the show's world worked. He described it as a "do not ask why aspect of the show, stating that logic simply did not have a place in the SpongeBob universe. The answer is not dismissive but accurate. The show operates according to its own internal rules, which are consistent within episodes and inconsistent between them, and which prioritize the needs of the joke over the demands of any physical or scientific framework. Karen, the waterproof supercomputer, exists because the story requires a supercomputer and the ocean requires things to be waterproof, and the show declines to further explain how those two requirements were met simultaneously, leaving the explanation in the category of things the audience is expected to accept and move forward from. Plankton's voice, which Lawrence built from an imitation of a deep-voiced high school friend, and described later as a combination of two specific cultural reference points from American performance history, was one of the first voices Lawrence developed for the show. He had originally auditioned for the role of SpongeBob himself during pre-production, been turned down because Hillenburg wanted something more innocent for the main character's voice, and continued working on the show in a writing capacity until the Plankton role became available. The voice he settled on for the character, once he was offered the part, draws on a low register that Lawrence has maintained across more than 2 decades of recording. The contrast between that voice and Tally's Karen, which carries a different quality of sardonic precision in a higher register, creates the specific texture of their arguments, a dynamic that Kenny compared to The Honeymooners, the classic American television sitcom built around a bickering married couple whose fights were the premise rather than the exception. Lawrence has spoken about what drew him personally to developing Karen and Plankton as a married unit rather than leaving the relationship as a purely professional one. His reasoning was rooted in what comedy requires to sustain itself over time. A villain who simply schemes and fails is a loop, self-contained, generating the same basic shape of joke regardless of how many times it repeats. A villain who schemes, fails, and then has to go home and account for himself to a partner who saw the failure coming and said so before it happened is a different kind of story, one that adds a domestic layer of accountability to the fantasy of villainy. And accountability is almost always funnier than pure capability. Plankton is more interesting as a character because Karen exists to remind him and the audience that his self-image as a formidable evil genius is subject to ongoing review by someone who knows him better than any enemy ever could. The specific quality Hillenburg identified in his wife when he designed the character around her sarcasm was not simply wit. Sarcasm in the abstract is a broad category that covers everything from gentle irony to genuine cruelty. What the show built into Karen, through Lawrence's writing and Tally's performance, is a more specific version, the sarcasm of someone who is fundamentally on your side and cannot pretend otherwise, who finds your failures frustrating precisely because they were avoidable, and who tells you so clearly because they have calculated that honesty is more useful to you than comfort, even when you have not asked for the calculation. It is the sarcasm of partnership rather than contempt, and the distinction is what prevents Karen from reading as simply cold or dismissive across 25 years of episodes. She is sharp because she cares, and the show takes care to make that visible in the episodes that give her enough room to show it. The anniversary episode, Single Cell Anniversary, is probably the clearest example of this. The episode centers on Plankton forgetting his anniversary with Karen and scrambling to recover, a premise the show plays largely for laughs, built around his incompetence as a partner. What the episode eventually produces, through a song performed as a genuine act of affection between the two characters, is one of those moments the show was capable of when it chose to step entirely outside the ironic frame and let a relationship mean what it appeared to mean. The song is straightforward, the sentiment is legible, and the fact that it belongs to a scene between a microscopic evil copepod and a wall-mounted supercomputer does not diminish it. Lawrence has pointed to that episode specifically as evidence that the married dynamic was capable of more than comedy, that the investment the writers had made in building Karen and Plankton as a genuine partnership rather than a functional arrangement paid off in moments like that one in ways that would not have been available otherwise. What Karen became over the course of the show's run is something Hillenburg could not have fully anticipated when he wrote the name of his wife on a character in a series Bible. The specific woman he was honoring with the gesture, the one he called the funniest person he knew, never successfully recorded a line of dialogue for the character bearing her name. The voice that filled the role belonged to someone else, someone who brought her own specific quality to the character and shaped who Karen became through 25 years of performance. The name stayed, the inspiration stayed, the sarcasm that Hillenburg recognized in his wife and built into the character stayed. What arrived in the recording studio to give all of that shape and sound was Jill Talley, whose husband was simultaneously giving shape and sound to the character Karen spends most of her screen time helping and criticizing and occasionally crowd surfing past during a rock concert, while her villain husband watches in dismay. The real Karen Hillenburg, the one who could not get through the recording session, heard her name in every episode that ever aired. Hillenburg passed away in November of 2018 after a period of illness, and Karen Hillenburg outlived him. The character named after her continues to appear in the show and its spin-offs, voiced by Talley, written by a team that has expanded considerably since the years when Lawrence was the primary architect of the Plankton and Karen dynamic. The connection between the cartoon and the real woman is carried now entirely in the name, a thread of personal history woven into a franchise that has grown far larger than any single personal gesture, still visible to anyone who looks for it and knows what they are looking at. There is something worth sitting with in what that name represents across all the years it has been in the show. Every viewer who has watched any episode featuring Karen has heard the name without knowing it belonged first to a real person sitting somewhere in California. The person the creator of the whole world considered funniest of all. The tribute was never explained in any episode, never acknowledged in any on-screen moment, never pointed to by the show itself as a detail requiring attention. It simply existed, the way the most personal choices in any creative work tend to exist, quietly and without instruction, waiting for the audience to know enough to recognize what they were looking at. Most of the audience never did, and the name kept playing across every speaker the show ever came out of, carrying its small piece of biography through decades of broadcasts. The creator's private acknowledgement of the funniest person he knew, permanently embedded in the villain's wife, who was always, underneath everything, the smartest one in the room. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A character named after the creator's wife carries a voice that was never supposed to belong to the performer who gave it. The original plan lost on a nervous recording day that became one of the more quietly human moments in the show's production history. Next comes the final entry, the character whose existence raises a question the show answered in supplemental materials but refused to answer on screen, and whose creator reportedly received letters about her for as long as the show ran. Section 10. The Whale Who Was Never Explained. Every relationship in Bikini Bottom comes with some version of a reason. SpongeBob and Patrick are best friends because they are neighbors of similar temperament and limitless availability. Two characters whose capacity for enthusiasm makes them natural companions, even when their interests diverge. Squidward tolerates his neighbors because he is physically incapable of leaving without giving up the life he has built, modest as that life is. Plankton and Mr. Krabs are enemies because of a specific, documented rupture in a friendship that predated either of their restaurants, a falling out over a recipe that the show traced back across decades in the episode Friend or Foe. Sandy came to Bikini Bottom under contract, with employers and deliverables, and a tree dome full of equipment that points back to a specific professional arrangement. Gary evolved from a background prop into a main character because the audience decided he mattered before the writers did. Every connection in the show has tissue underneath it, something the audience can point to if asked. Then there is Pearl. Pearl Krabs is a sperm whale. She is approximately 16 years old across most of the show's run, a teenager who lives in a hollow anchor with her father, attends Bikini Bottom High School, works part-time at a store for elderly residents called Grandma's Apron at the Bikini Bottom Mall, and will one day inherit the Krusty Krab, a prospect she regards with the same enthusiasm most teenagers bring to the idea of eventually doing the work their parents currently do, which is to to say, almost none. She is larger than every other character in the main cast by a margin so significant it functions as its own category of visual comedy. Her arrival in any room announced by the trembling of floors and the rattling of objects on shelves. She cries at a scale commensurate with her body, producing floods that require the Krabs family home to be equipped with drain plugs specifically designed to empty the residence afterward. When she jumps, the entire Krusty Krab shakes. When she is sad, the amount of water she produces is a structural problem for whatever building she happens to be inside. Her father is a crab. This has never been explained in any episode of the show. The species difference between Pearl and Mr. Krabs is one of the most consistently discussed pieces of background lore in the show's entire fan community. Not because the show has made it a mystery in any dramatic sense, but precisely because it is not. The show introduces the two characters as father and daughter in the first season episode Squeaky Boots, and then declines permanently to acknowledge that anything about this arrangement requires comment. No character in Bikini Bottom has ever, across more than 2 decades of episodes, pointed to Mr. Krabs and his whale daughter and asked the obvious question. The town appears to have absorbed this family configuration with the same matter-of-fact acceptance it extends to a pufferfish teacher with a criminal record, a starfish who lives under a rock that turned out to be a sleeping turtle, and a squirrel from Texas who built a pressurized dome on the ocean floor and calls it home. In Bikini Bottom, the Krabs family situation is simply not remarkable enough to mention. Hillenburg's explanation for why a crab would have a whale for a daughter was given outside the show itself in response to the letters he reportedly received from viewers asking exactly that question across the years the show ran. His answer was precise and entirely practical. He wanted each member of the main cast to be a different animal. The roster he had assembled by the time Pearl joined it covered an enormous range of marine and land biology without repeating a species. Adding another character required adding something not yet represented, and a sperm whale, the largest toothed predator currently living on Earth, offered visual comedy possibilities that no species closer in scale to the existing cast could have provided in the same way. Pearl is large in a context where almost everyone else is small, and the comedy generated by that size difference is available in virtually every scene she enters without any additional setup being required. She is a whale because Hillenburg needed a whale in the cast, and because a whale, as the teenage daughter of a crab, was funnier than a whale appearing in any other capacity the show could have constructed for her. The in-universe explanation, offered not in any episode, but in the official SpongeBob SquarePants trivia book published in 2000, is that Pearl takes after her mother. The book states this plainly, implying that Pearl is the biological offspring of Mr. Krabs and a female whale who was at some point his wife, meaning the species difference between Pearl and her father is explained by the genetics of her maternal line, rather than by any adoption or other arrangement. This explanation raises its own complications, since it requires accepting that a crab and a whale produced offspring, and that the offspring took entirely after the whale parent, without inheriting any visible crab characteristics. A biological proposition the show's nuclear testing backstory and its general relationship with scientific accuracy make slightly more defensible than they would be in any other fictional context. The show that can explain a talking sponge with a driver's license by pointing to decades of underwater nuclear detonation can probably accommodate a cross-species birth without requiring a dedicated episode to establish it. The official name given to Pearl's mother in the trivia book is Mrs. Krabs, which is to say the book names her by her married title rather than by any given name, and her current whereabouts are described as unknown. She is absent from everything. Whatever happened to her has not been explained, and Hillenburg was reportedly strongly and consistently opposed to explaining it on screen. According to the show's creative director Vincent Waller, Hillenburg received many letters from viewers requesting an origin story for Pearl, and he was firmly against resolving the mystery in any episode. An episode exploring Pearl's origin was written at some point during the show's production history and entered early development stages before Hillenburg intervened and shut it down. His position was that the unexplained nature of the family was part of what made it interesting, that spelling out the mechanics of how a crab married a whale and had a whale daughter would reduce rather than enrich the show's world by converting an open question into a closed one. Since Hillenburg passed away in November of 2018, the fate of that unproduced episode, and whether its contents were ever documented in any form that survives within the production, remains unclear from any public account of the show's history. Pearl's name carries its own quiet layer of meaning that the show embedded without ever stating directly in an episode. The phrase, "Mother of Pearl," is an exclamation Mr. Krabs uses throughout the series as a substitute for stronger language in moments of shock or distress. The underwater equivalent of a surface world character reaching for something just strong enough to express genuine alarm without crossing into territory unsuitable for a children's broadcast. The name Pearl, given to his daughter, echoes that phrase in a way that Nickelodeon's official materials confirmed was intentional. Mr. Krabs named his daughter after the expression he uses when frightened or overwhelmed, an expression that itself carries a reference to the mother his daughter no longer has. Every time he uses the phrase in an episode, which is frequently across the show's run, he is invoking both his daughter and the parent his daughter has grown up without, a piece of wordplay embedded so quietly into the fabric of the dialogue that most viewers absorbed it without registering it as anything other than a funny catchphrase from a cartoon crab. The design of Pearl went through a conceptual stage quite different from what eventually reached broadcast. In the 1996 pitch Bible for the series, during the period when the show was still titled SpongeBob Ahoy, Pearl was envisioned as part of a more nomadic arrangement, with Mr. Krabs and his daughter living and traveling in a caravan boat equipped with a whale-sized trailer. That version of the concept was revised before production began, with a fixed anchor-shaped house replacing the mobile arrangement and giving the Krabs family a permanent address within Bikini Bottom's suburban geography. The shift from nomadic to settled reflects the broader changes Hillenburg made in developing the world from the pitch Bible stage to broadcast-ready production, building toward the specific kind of neighborhood comedy that works best when characters are rooted in a place and cannot simply leave it when things become difficult. Hillenburg drew the physical design of Pearl during his time working at the Ocean Institute in Dana Point, where his responsibilities included supervising whale watch programs for visiting members of the public. He spent years watching real sperm whales from boats, developing the kind of familiarity with the species that comes only from sustained, direct observation, rather than from textbook descriptions. When he needed a whale character, he drew from that accumulated visual experience. The decision to make Pearl's head an almost rectangular geometric shape, pushing the real sperm whale's large and distinctively squarish skull to the point of abstraction, connects to a specific anatomical reality about sperm whales that Hillenburg understood from his scientific background. Sperm whales have the largest brain of any extant animal on Earth, housed in a skull so unusually shaped that it constitutes one of the most immediately recognizable silhouettes in marine biology. Pearl's oversized, nearly geometric head is a caricature of that real anatomy, and the show acknowledged what that anatomy implies about cognitive capacity by depicting Pearl as genuinely gifted in mathematics in episodes that gave her enough room to demonstrate it, a detail that sits in interesting contrast against her primary characterization as a teenager more interested in shopping and popular music than in anything resembling academic life. Lori Allen has voiced Pearl since the character's first appearance, a casting that she has described as arriving during a particularly busy period of her early Los Angeles career. Her approach to the character drew from observations of real teenage girls, amplified to account for the physical scale of what she was voicing. The emotional responses of a teenager who weighs as much as a sperm whale and whose crying produces structural flooding required a vocal quality capable of carrying both the recognizable register of adolescent social drama and the specific absurdity of those responses being expressed at that scale. Allen found that balance across Pearl's debut season and has maintained it consistently through decades of episodes, the voice itself remaining stable enough that Pearl reads as the same character across a run so long that every other element of the show's production has changed around her multiple times. Pearl's relationship with her father is the emotional center of her presence in the show, and it operates operates on a specific tension that the series returns to without ever fully resolving. Mr. Krabs loves his daughter. The show establishes this clearly enough across episodes that treat the relationship with something closer to genuine sentiment than to satire, and the establishment is consistent enough that it never reads as ambiguous. He attends her events, he suffers through her taste in popular music, an all-boys band called Boys Who Cry, whose appeal he cannot fathom, and whose merchandise apparently costs him money he resents spending. He agrees to escort her to prom when her actual date fails to appear, arriving in a situation that costs him far more dignity than money, which for his character represents a more significant sacrifice than the financial one. He manages the ongoing task of being the father of a teenager who finds him embarrassing, with more patience than his treatment of his employees across the entire run of the show would suggest he was capable of producing for anyone. The cheapness that defines every professional relationship Mr. Krabs maintains bleeds into his personal life often enough to cause real friction between them, but the show is consistently careful to establish that his love for Pearl operates outside the financial calculation that governs everything else. He spends money on her that he would guard elsewhere with a ferocity the show treats as central to his character. He absorbs embarrassment from her in quantities that would end his relationships with anyone else. He makes himself small in ways that his ego would not permit in any other context. The evidence accumulates across seasons into something the show never states directly because it does not need to. The crab is capable of valuing something above money, and the proof exists only in the whale he cannot explain. What Pearl's character also reveals, across the episodes that give her enough room to exist as something beyond a recurring visual gag about a teenager who is disproportionately large for her surroundings, is a loneliness that the show handles with more delicacy than its reputation for broad comedy might suggest. Her friends in any given episode tend to be shallow and quick to abandon her, the social world of Bikini Bottom High treating her size as a defining characteristic that overrides anything else she might be. She shifts between wanting desperately to fit in and recognizing that the specific terms of fitting in available to her require pretending to be something she is not, a tension that the show occasionally resolves through episodes in which Pearl simply decides she does not need the approval she was chasing, and that her father's embarrassing presence and her own enormous floods rooms when she cries personality are things she is capable of living with comfortably. Those resolutions never quite stick across episodes, because the show has no interest in resolving teenage insecurity once and for all, but they produce moments in which Pearl reads as a fully considered character rather than a recurring punchline. She also carries, below all of it, the specific texture of someone growing up without a clear account of where she came from. The absent mother is never discussed with Pearl directly in any episode. She does not appear to raise questions about it, at least not on screen, and the show extends to her the same courtesy it extends to the audience. The silence is not presented as painful, just as present, a missing piece of information that shapes the outline of the family without being named as a loss. Whether Pearl knows the full story of her mother, knows a partial version, or simply grew up inside the gap without anyone having explained it, is something the show never clarifies, and Hillenburg's resistance to the origin episode suggests he intended for it to stay that way. The daughter as unexplained as the circumstances of her arrival, both of them accepted by the town and by the show itself, without requiring documentation. The real complexity of Pearl as a character, the layer most viewers interacted with least because it required the most contextual information to access, is what her unexplained existence says about the show's approach to its own world. Bikini Bottom is a place built on buried history, its cheerful suburban surface resting on strata of stranger, older things that surface occasionally and then return to invisibility. The nuclear tests are below it. The real atoll is below that. Gary's hidden intelligence is below his meow. The lobster trap is below the restaurant. The personal tribute is below Karen's name. Pearl's unexplained mother is below everything in the Krabs family anchor, present in the drain plugs installed to handle the flooding when a teenage whale cries, and present in the catchphrase her father reaches for when he is frightened, named and unnamed at the same time, as absent and as felt as any unexplained unacknowledged loss tends to be in the life of the person carrying it. Hillenburg kept the explanation out. He kept it out deliberately, insistently, through years of letters from viewers who wanted to know, and through at least one written episode that came close to providing an answer before he stopped it. He kept it out until the end of his involvement with the series, and apparently intended for it to stay out indefinitely. The question was more valuable than any answer available to it, and the show, at its best, understood that the right response to certain kinds of gaps was not to fill them, but to honor them, to let the absence do the work that an explanation would only diminish. What this whole video has traced, moving from section to section across 10 different corners of Bikini Bottom, is a pattern that the show wore lightly and carried consistently. The most meaningful things it contained were the ones it never announced. The real place under the name, the trap under the restaurant, the octopus under the squid's name, the real oceanographer under the French accent, the personal tribute under the computer's name, the Polynesian tradition under the pineapple's shape, the background detail that became a main character, the compromise that became a fully realized person, the creator's wife who never got through the recording. All of it sitting inside a show that most people watched as something cheerful and fast and disposable, a cartoon about a sponge, not worth looking at too closely because there was probably nothing there to find. There was always something there to find. It was built by someone who knew the ocean well enough to understand that the most interesting things in it are rarely visible from the surface, and who spent 25 years putting that understanding into a cartoon that kept its deepest details quiet, trusting that the audience willing to look would eventually find them, and that the audience who never looked would still somehow feel the weight of what was underneath without being able to say why. The ocean contains stranger things than a crab raising a whale in a hollow anchor on the floor of the Pacific. Hillenburg knew this from years of watching it. He built a world that made room for strangeness without requiring it to account for itself. And Pearl Krabs, the unexplained teenager in the pink cheerleader outfit, stomping through Bikini Bottom and flooding rooms and missing a mother the show never named, was his clearest reminder that the most important presences in any world sometimes arrive without documentation, and that the story does not need them to explain themselves before it loves them. 25 years of letters ask the question. The answer was always the same shape: a crab and his whale daughter living in an anchor, not explaining anything, and the show being richer for the silence than it ever would have been for the words. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.